Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The floorboards beneath my feet had long since settled into silence, but above me, the ceiling seemed too weighted with sound. An unsteady rhythm lingered as if someone had ascended halfway, then hesitated. Shadows stretched across the walls, swaying gently with a source I couldn't see. My breath felt caught between seconds, heavy with the anticipation of something that refused to manifest. In the stillness, a draft brushed past, lifting the hem of a curtain just enough to reveal bare light where a figure should have stood. The nausea comes first, always first. It starts somewhere behind my ribs and spreads outward like ink in water, staining everything with its presence. I've learned to recognize its approach the way my skin grows cold from the inside out, the way my mouth fills with the taste of copper pennies. It's been weeks now, maybe months, since I could wake without feeling like I'm drowning in my own body. The house remembers things I've forgotten or pretend to have forgotten. The way light falls through the kitchen window still makes my hands shake, though I can't recall why. There was coffee brewing that morning, the smell thick and bitter, and someone was humming, a tune I should know but can't place. The melody loops in my head at odd hours, usually when I'm trying to sleep. Usually when the ceiling starts its restless creaking. I find myself checking locks that were already checked, turning handles that won't turn. My fingers trace the same path along the door frame, searching for something that isn't there, or maybe something that shouldn't be there. The wood feels different under my touch, smoother in some places, rougher in others, as if it's been worn by hands other than mine. The detective had small eyes. I remember that clearly, though everything else about our conversation blurs together like watercolors in rain. She asked about the timeline, about what I saw, about what I heard. But how do you explain that time doesn't move in straight lines anymore? That some moments stretch like taffy while others collapse into themselves, becoming dense and impenetrable. There was blood on the bathroom mirror, just a smear really, could have been anything, could have been nothing. I cleaned it away with paper towels that turned pink in my hands, but the stain seemed to seep deeper into the glass with each wipe. Now when I look at my reflection, I see it lurking just beneath the surface, a shadow that moves when I don't. The phone rang 17 times before I answered. I counted. Counting helps sometimes, gives my mind something solid to hold on to when everything else feels like it's sliding away. The voice on the other end was familiar but wrong somehow, like a song played in the wrong key. They asked if I was all right, if I needed anything, if I wanted company. But company means explanations, and explanations require a kind of clarity I no longer possess. Sleep brings no relief. In dreams, I'm always walking through the house, but it's not quite the same house. The rooms are in the wrong order, the walls breathe like living things, and there are doors that open onto nothing but darkness. I wake with the taste of dust in my mouth and the feeling that I've been searching for something all night, something just out of reach. The stairs creak in a specific pattern. 3rd step, 7th step, then silence. I've memorized the sequence, though I'm not sure why it matters. Sometimes I hear it when no one is climbing, when I'm alone and the house should be still. The sound comes from above, always above, as if someone is perpetually ascending but never quite reaching the top. There were flowers in the kitchen that morning, white ones with petals like tissue paper. I remember thinking they looked funeral fresh, too perfect for the shabby vase that held them. When I touched one, it crumbled between my fingers, leaving a fine powder that smelled of earth and endings. The water in the vase had turned cloudy, and something dark floated near the bottom. My hands won't stop shaking. It started as a tremor, barely noticeable, but now it's constant. I spill coffee, drop keys, fumble with simple tasks that once required no thought. The doctor says it's stress, prescribes pills that make my thoughts feel wrapped in cotton. But the shaking isn't in my muscles, it's deeper than that, in the place where certainty used to live. The neighbor's dog stopped barking. I didn't notice at first, was almost grateful for the quiet. But now the silence feels wrong, expectant. That dog barked at everything: squirrels, shadows, the wind itself. Its absence is louder than its presence ever was, a negative space that draws attention like a missing tooth. I keep finding things in the wrong places. My keys in the refrigerator, books in the bathroom, clothes folded neatly in rooms I never enter. At first, I blamed forgetfulness, the stress-induced fog that makes everything feel distant and strange. But there's a deliberateness to these displacements, a logic I can't quite grasp. The detective called again, or maybe I called her. The conversation exists in fragments, her voice asking about inconsistencies in my statement, my voice trying to explain things that don't make sense even to me. She mentioned evidence, witnesses, a timeline that doesn't match my memory. But memory is a liar, isn't it? It tells us what we need to hear, not what actually happened. There's a stain on the living room carpet that wasn't there before. Dark and oddly shaped, like a map of somewhere I've never been. I've scrubbed at it with every cleaner I can find, but it only seems to spread, seeping deeper into the fibers. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, trying to discern patterns, trying to read meaning in its irregular borders. The humming comes at night now, always the same tune, always from somewhere I can't locate. It might be coming from inside the walls or from inside my head. The distinction has become meaningless. The melody is familiar yet foreign, like a childhood lullaby sung in a language I don't recognize. I found a photograph tucked behind the mirror in the hallway. Not mine, not one I remember taking or keeping. It shows a room that might be in this house or might be somewhere else entirely. The light is wrong, casting shadows that fall upward instead of down. In the corner, barely visible, is a figure that could be anyone, could be no one. The taste of copper never leaves my mouth now. I brush my teeth until my gums bleed, rinse with mouthwash that burns, but the metallic tang persists. It's strongest in the morning, weakest at night, as if it follows some internal tide I can't control. Time moves strangely in the house. I'll sit down to read and find hours have passed without my notice, or I'll spend what feels like an entire afternoon cleaning, only to discover the clock has barely moved. The sun seems to hang in the same position for impossibly long periods, then suddenly plunge toward the horizon as if making up for lost time. There are voices in the walls, not words exactly, but something like conversation, the rise and fall of human speech stripped of meaning. They're clearest in the bathroom, where the pipes run behind thin plaster. I've learned not to listen too closely, not to try to make sense of what they might be saying. The detective's eyes were the color of old pennies, or maybe they were blue. Memory plays tricks, substitutes details, fills in blanks with whatever seems most fitting. She asked about my relationship with the missing person, about the last time we spoke, about whether I noticed anything unusual. But unusual compared to what? Everything feels unusual now. I keep washing my hands. The skin is raw, cracked, but I can't seem to get them clean. There's always something under my nails, some dark residue that scrubs away only to return. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looks thinner each day, more translucent, as if I'm slowly fading from existence. The house breathes at night. I feel it in the way the walls expand and contract, in the subtle shifts of air pressure that make my ears pop. It's alive in ways that houses shouldn't be. aware in ways that make me question everything I thought I knew about the boundary between animate and inanimate. There was a key in my coat pocket that I don't remember putting there. Old brass, worn smooth by countless hands. It doesn't fit any lock in the house, but I carry it with me anyway, turning it over in my fingers like a talisman. Sometimes it feels warm, sometimes cold, as if responding to something I can't perceive. The stairs seem longer than they used to be. Climbing them leaves me breathless, though I'm not out of shape. Each step requires more effort than the last, as if gravity grows stronger with altitude. At the top, I always pause, listening for that unsteady rhythm that started all of this. Sleep comes in fragments now. I drift off for minutes at a time, waking with the sensation of falling, of being pulled back from someplace I shouldn't have gone. My dreams are full of empty rooms and closing doors, of footsteps that echo long after their source has vanished. The flowers keep appearing, always white, always wilting, always in places they shouldn't be. I throw them away, but more appear on the kitchen table by the front door, scattered across the bathroom floor like fallen snow. Their presence feels like an accusation, though I can't say of what. My reflection in windows shows someone I barely recognize. The features are mine, but arranged differently, as if seen through water or thick glass. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement behind me in the reflection, but when I turn, there's nothing there. The detective's questions circle back on themselves. She asks the same things in different ways, as if trying to catch me in a contradiction. But how can you contradict something that was never solid to begin with? My answers change because the truth changes, reshaping itself with each telling. There's a room in the house I've stopped entering, not because it's locked or forbidden, but because it feels wrong somehow. The air inside is thicker, harder to breathe. The shadows fall at impossible angles. When I stand in the doorway, I can almost see something moving in my peripheral vision, but it vanishes the moment I try to focus on it. The taste of dust mingles with copper now. My mouth feels full of sediment, as if I've been eating earth. Water doesn't help, food doesn't help. Nothing washes away the flavor of endings, of things buried too shallow to stay hidden. I found footprints in the garden, pressed into soil that should have been too hard to take impressions. They lead from the back door to the fence, then simply stop, as if their owner had been lifted into the air. The prints are the right size, the right shape, but they point in the wrong direction away from the house when they should point toward it. The ceiling creaks with more purpose now. The sounds form patterns, almost like code. I've tried to decode them, mapping the creaks to letters, to words, to meaning. But meaning is slippery, and the patterns change just when I think I understand them. There are gaps in my memory that feel deliberate, spaces where something important should be but isn't. When I try to remember what happened in those missing hours, my mind slides away like it's been greased. The harder I push, the more elusive the memories become. The house knows what I've forgotten. It holds the memories in its walls, in the spaces between its boards. Sometimes I think if I could just listen carefully enough, press my ear to the right surface, I might hear them whispering back to me. But do I really want to remember? Some forgetting might be a gift. The key in my pocket grows heavier each day. Not physically, it weighs the same few ounces it always has. But it pulls at me, demands attention, insists on being acknowledged. I've started talking to it, asking what it opens, what it's meant to unlock. It never answers, but sometimes it seems to pulse with warmth, as if responding to questions I haven't learned to ask. The detective's face is becoming harder to recall. Was her hair dark or light? Did she wear glasses? The details blur together, becoming generic, archetypal. She represents authority, investigation, the search for truth. But truth is negotiable, isn't it? Truth is whatever version of events creates the least damage. I stand at the bottom of the stairs, listening to that unsteady rhythm above. Someone climbing halfway, then hesitating. The sound is clearer now, more distinct. I recognize the weight of the footsteps, the particular creak each step produces. I know who's climbing those stairs, who's been climbing them all along. But knowing and accepting are different things. My hand grips the banister, and I feel the smooth groove worn by countless other hands. The house remembers every touch, every passage, every secret whispered in its shadows. It remembers what I'm still trying to forget. The figure at the top of the stairs waits patiently, as it always has. Not quite visible, not quite gone. Existing in that liminal space between presence and absence, between memory and reality. I could climb up to meet it, could finally confront what I've been avoiding, but some encounters change you in ways you can't undo. Instead, I turn away as I always do. The nausea rises again, that familiar companion. The taste of copper floods my mouth. My hands shake as I check the locks one more time, trace the doorframe with trembling fingers. The house settles around me, holding its secrets close. Above, the footsteps resume their patient rhythm, climbing halfway, then hesitating, waiting for me to remember, to acknowledge, to climb those stairs myself. But I'm not ready yet. Maybe I never will be. The shadows on the walls continue their gentle sway, moved by sources I can't see. The curtain lifts in that persistent draft, revealing empty space where something should be standing, and I remain at the bottom of the stairs, caught between forgetting and remembering, between the truth I know and the truth I can bear to live with. Story 2. The latch didn't catch as I closed the door. My fingers grazed over its surface, anticipating a familiar resistance, but nothing held. Each footstep was muted, absorbed by the carpet that felt softer, deeper than I recalled. I glanced towards the place on the wall where shadows usually stretched and shifted, their absence resonating more than their presence ever did. The light switch clicked, but the room stubbornly rejected illumination, as if the darkness had taken root. An uneasy stillness settled around me, leaving me to wonder if the air itself had forgotten how to move. I knew what had happened in this room. The certainty of it had carried me through countless sleepless nights, through police interviews, through the hollow condolences of neighbors who spoke in whispers. My sister had taken her own life here in what used to be her study. The evidence was clear, documented, filed away in manila folders that smelled of bureaucracy and finality. A single chair overturned beneath the ceiling beam. A note folded neatly on her desk, written in her careful handwriting. The door locked from the inside, the key still resting on the floor where it had fallen from her fingers. The investigators had been thorough but gentle, explaining how these things sometimes happen without warning signs, how even those closest to someone can miss the subtle shifts in mood, the quiet preparations. I had nodded, accepted their conclusions, signed the papers that needed signing. The insurance company had processed the claim without dispute. The funeral home had handled the arrangements with practiced sympathy. Everything had proceeded exactly as it should when someone chooses to leave this world on their own terms. But standing here now, surrounded by the weight of darkness that seemed too heavy for a simple burned-out bulb, I found myself studying details I had somehow overlooked before. The carpet beneath my feet felt different, not just thicker but wrong somehow, as if it had been replaced recently. I knelt down, running my palms across its surface, and noticed how the fibers seemed newer near the center of the room, while the edges retained the familiar worn texture I remembered from childhood visits. The smell was wrong too. I had expected the musty staleness of a room sealed away from life, but instead there was something else, a faint chemical sweetness that reminded me of the cleaning supplies our mother used to buy in bulk. My sister had always been particular about scents, preferring natural oils and handmade soaps. She would never have used anything that left such an artificial residue in the air. I moved toward the desk where her note had been found, my fingers trailing along its familiar surface. The wood felt smooth, too smooth, as if it had been recently polished. But my sister had never been one for housekeeping, preferring to let books and papers accumulate in comfortable chaos. The desk's pristine condition struck me as odd, almost sterile in its cleanliness. The note itself had been brief, apologetic, final. I had read it so many times that I could recite it from memory, each word burned into my consciousness like a brand. But now, trying to recall the exact formation of her letters, I found myself questioning details that had once seemed unshakable. Had her handwriting really looked quite right? The loops of her letters had always been generous, flowing, but in my memory the note seemed more cramped, more controlled than her usual style. A sound from somewhere in the house made me freeze, a soft thud, like something settling or shifting position. Old houses make noises, I told myself, especially when they've been empty for months. But the sound had come from upstairs, from what used to be her bedroom, and it carried with it an intentionality that random settling couldn't explain. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step producing a creak that seemed amplified in the silence. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it during my last visit. The gap was narrow, just wide enough to suggest an invitation or a warning. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room looked exactly as it had been left, or at least as I remembered it being left. But memory, I was beginning to understand, might not be the reliable narrator I had always assumed it to be. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked and smoothed in a way that seemed foreign to my sister's casual relationship with domestic order. She had always been the type to leave beds unmade, dishes in the sink, books splayed open wherever she had last been reading. On the nightstand sat a glass of water, still clear, still full. I lifted it to my lips without thinking, then stopped. How could water remain fresh after all this time? The house had been sealed, the utilities disconnected. Any liquid left behind should have been stale, dusty, evaporated. Yet this glass held water that looked and smelled as if it had been poured moments before my arrival. The closet door was closed, but I could see light seeping from beneath it, impossible light, since there was no electricity in the house, no windows in that small space. I approached it with growing dread, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The door swung open to reveal clothes hanging in neat rows, but these weren't my sister's clothes. They belonged to someone else, someone whose taste ran to darker colors, more conservative cuts. Among the unfamiliar garments, I found a jacket I recognized, one I had been wearing the last time I visited my sister, the last time we had spoken. But that conversation had not taken place here in her house. We had met at a coffee shop downtown, argued about her recent behavior, her new friends, her increasingly erratic decisions. Or had we? The memory felt fluid now, uncertain, as if someone had taken a photograph and gently blurred its edges. I pulled the jacket from its hanger and searched the pockets. In the left breast pocket I found a key, small, brass, unfamiliar. It was warm to the touch, as if it had been recently handled. The metal felt smooth except for tiny scratches near the teeth, the kind of wear that comes from repeated use. But I had never seen this key before, had no idea what lock it might open. The house around me seemed to shift and breathe as I stood there, holding this impossible object. Walls that had felt solid now seemed to pulse with hidden activity. The floor beneath my feet creaked with the weight of footsteps that weren't mine. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the soft murmur of voices, too low to understand but too distinct to dismiss as imagination. I made my way back downstairs, the key clutched in my palm like a talisman. In the study where my sister had supposedly died, I began to examine everything with new eyes. The overturned chair looked staged now, positioned too perfectly beneath the beam to be the result of a desperate final act. The rope that had been used showed no signs of stretching or fraying, as if it had never actually borne any weight. But if my sister hadn't died here, where was she? And if she had died here, who had died in her place? The questions multiplied like cells dividing, each one spawning new uncertainties that threatened to overwhelm my capacity for rational thought. I found myself wondering if I had ever really known my sister at all, or if the person I remembered was just another fiction, another carefully constructed lie. The brass key seemed to grow heavier in my hand as I stood in that dark room, surrounded by evidence that no longer made sense. Outside, I could hear a car engine idling, though no headlights penetrated the windows. Footsteps approached the front door, measured and deliberate. Someone was coming, someone who had a key of their own, someone who belonged in this house more than I did. I realized then that I might not be the investigator in this story. I might be something else entirely, the suspect, the victim, the unwitting accomplice to a crime I couldn't even name. The certainty that had brought me here was dissolving like sugar in rain, leaving behind only questions that led to more questions, mysteries that deepened with every answer I thought I had found. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A key turned in the lock, not the broken latch I had encountered, but a different lock, one that worked perfectly. The door opened slowly, deliberately, and I understood that whoever was entering had been expecting to find me here. They had known I would come, known I would begin to doubt, known I would discover just enough truth to make me dangerous to myself and others. I pressed myself against the wall, still clutching the brass key, still trying to understand what role I was meant to play in this unfolding drama. The darkness that had seemed so oppressive now felt protective, hiding me from eyes that might not have my best interests at heart. But darkness, I was learning, could hide many things, including the truth about who I really was and what I had really done. The person in the doorway called my name softly, almost tenderly, as if they were trying not to frighten me. But their voice carried undertones of something else, disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. They had been hoping, I realized, that I would never come here, never start asking questions, never begin to remember things that were supposed to stay forgotten. As their footsteps moved through the house, searching for me with the confidence of someone who knew every corner and hiding place, I found myself wondering if I had been here before, many times before, playing out this same scene with minor variations. The house felt too familiar, too much like a stage set designed specifically for this moment of revelation and doubt. The brass key in my hand might open any number of doors, but I was no longer certain I wanted to know what lay behind them. Some truths I was beginning to understand were meant to stay buried, not because they were too terrible to face, but because they revealed the terrible fluidity of reality itself, the way memory and truth could be reshaped like clay in the hands of someone with sufficient skill and motivation. The footsteps were getting closer now, moving through the house with purpose and familiarity. Soon there would be nowhere left to hide, no more shadows to shelter in, no more questions to ask before the answers arrived, whether I wanted them or not. And I found myself wondering if the person approaching was my sister, alive and well and playing a game whose rules I had never understood, or if they were someone else entirely, someone who had been waiting a very long time for me to finally come home. Story 3. The chime. It sounded like a bell chiming softly, but no one else seemed to hear it. The tone lingered in the air, haunting and out of tune, as if coaxed from tarnished brass hidden somewhere in the shadows. I stood in the narrow hallway, half expecting to find a source, but the familiar walls offered nothing. My fingers brushed the wallpaper, tracing imperfections that felt newly unfamiliar. The chime echoed again, slipping past the edges of my memory, stirring an image of an old clock tower that loomed over a street I'd never seen. Reality blurred at the edges, and an unsettling calm settled in my chest. I hadn't felt this disquiet since the day I lost it all. The call came on a Tuesday that felt like any other. My sister's voice crackled through the phone, distant and hollow. She'd found something while cleaning out our grandmother's house, something that didn't make sense. Her words tumbled over each other, breathless and urgent, but I caught the important parts. A box, hidden beneath floorboards, photographs that shouldn't exist. I drove through winding roads that afternoon, past fields that stretched endlessly toward horizons I couldn't quite focus on. The house sat exactly as I remembered it, weathered shingles and paint peeling like old skin, but something felt different. The air carried a metallic taste, sharp and unpleasant. My sister met me at the door, her face pale and drawn. She'd aged in the weeks since I'd seen her last. She led me upstairs without speaking. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet, each step announcing our presence to the empty rooms. In the corner bedroom, a section of hardwood had been pried up, revealing a dark cavity beneath. The box sat on the bed, unremarkable brown cardboard that could have held anything. But the smell rising from it made my stomach clench. Dust and something else, something organic and wrong. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, photographs lay scattered like fallen leaves, black and white images that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. I recognized the faces immediately, though I wished I didn't. Family members, neighbors, people from our childhood who'd simply disappeared one summer, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions. But these weren't family portraits or casual snapshots. These were surveillance photographs taken from distances through windows, capturing moments that should have remained private. Each image bore a date stamp in faded red ink, marking time with mechanical precision. The dates spanned decades, beginning long before my birth and continuing until just recently. My sister's breathing grew shallow beside me. She pointed to a photograph near the bottom of the pile. A young woman walking alone down a tree-lined street, unaware of the camera's presence. The woman looked exactly like her, but the date stamp read from 20 years ago when my sister was still a child. We sat in silence, the photograph spread between us like evidence at a crime scene. The chiming sound returned, soft and persistent, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. I found myself counting the intervals between each tone, though I couldn't say why. 7 beats, always 7 beats. That evening I called the detective who'd handled the missing persons cases all those years ago. He retired long ago, but his voice still carried the weight of unsolved mysteries. When I described what we'd found, his silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had failed. Finally, he spoke. He'd always suspected there was more to those disappearances, more than random chance or people simply choosing to leave, but the evidence had never materialized until now. He agreed to meet me the following day at a diner on the edge of town. The place smelled of coffee and bacon grease, normal scents that should have been comforting. Instead, they seemed to mask something underneath, something that made my throat constrict. The detective looked older than I'd expected, his face mapped with lines that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He studied the photographs with professional detachment, though I noticed his hands weren't entirely steady. He recognized the locations, the angles from which they'd been taken. Someone had been watching these people for extended periods, learning their routines, documenting their movements with obsessive precision. The kind of surveillance that preceded something terrible. But what disturbed him most wasn't the photographs themselves. It was their condition. Despite being hidden for decades, they showed no signs of age or deterioration. The paper remained crisp, the images sharp and clear, as if they'd been developed recently, then artificially aged to create the illusion of time passing. He kept one photograph, promising to run it through databases that might reveal something useful. The image showed a man standing in a doorway, his face partially obscured by shadows, but his posture, the way he held his shoulders, seemed familiar, like someone I'd known but couldn't quite place. I drove home through streets that felt different in the darkness. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes. Every parked car might contain someone with a camera, documenting my movements for reasons I couldn't fathom. The paranoia felt both irrational and completely justified. At home, I spread the remaining photographs across my kitchen table, searching for patterns that might reveal their creator's identity. The angles suggested someone with access to multiple vantage points, rooftops, second-story windows, vehicles parked at strategic locations. This wasn't the work of a casual observer. This was systematic, professional, methodical. The chiming returned as I studied the images, soft and rhythmic like a heartbeat. I found myself synchronizing my breathing to its cadence, falling into a trance-like state where the photographs seemed to move and shift before my eyes. Faces became clearer, details emerged that I hadn't noticed before. In one image, a woman walked past a storefront window, but reflected in the glass, barely visible, was another figure. Someone following at a distance, camera raised. The reflection was too blurred to make out features, but the build and stance triggered a memory I couldn't quite grasp. I called my sister, needing to share this discovery, but her phone went straight to voicemail, her recorded voice sounding strange and distant. I left a message, trying to keep my tone casual despite the anxiety crawling up my spine. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Every creak and settling sound made me freeze, listening for footsteps that never came. The detective called back 3 days later. His voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. The photograph I'd given him had yielded results, but not the kind we'd hoped for. The man in the doorway had been identified through facial recognition software. He died 15 years ago in a car accident on a mountain road, but the photograph's date stamp indicated it had been taken just months ago. Either someone was manipulating evidence with sophisticated technology, or something far more disturbing was happening. The detective's voice dropped to barely above a whisper when he shared his theory. What if the disappearances hadn't been random? What if someone had been collecting these people, keeping them somewhere, continuing to document their lives in captivity? The idea felt both impossible and horribly plausible. I thought about the woman who looked like my sister, walking down that street 20 years before my sister could have been there. What if it wasn't coincidence? What if it was her mother or grandmother or some other relative whose existence had been erased from family records? I began researching our family history with obsessive intensity, digging through records and archives that revealed gaps and inconsistencies I'd never noticed before. Relatives who appeared in some documents but not others. Birth certificates that didn't match death records. A pattern of erasure that seemed deliberate and systematic. The chiming grew more frequent, sometimes occurring at regular intervals throughout the day. I started keeping a log, noting the time and duration of each occurrence. The pattern that emerged was complex but unmistakable. 7 chimes, followed by silence, then 7 more. Always the same rhythm, as if marking time according to some internal calendar I couldn't decipher. My sister finally returned my calls, but her voice sounded different, flatter, more distant, as if she were reading from a script. She claimed to have no memory of finding the photographs, insisted that the box had contained only old clothing and documents. When I pressed her for details, she became agitated, then abruptly ended the call. I drove to her house that evening, but found it dark and apparently empty. Her car was gone, though neighbors claimed they hadn't seen her leave. The mailbox overflowed with accumulated letters and packages. The newspapers had piled up on the front porch. It was as if she'd simply vanished, joining the ranks of those whose faces stared back at me from the photographs. Standing in her driveway, I felt eyes watching from the surrounding darkness. The sensation was so strong that I spun around, searching for movement in the shadows between houses. Nothing, but the feeling persisted, a crawling awareness that I was no longer the observer but the observed. The photographs were gone when I returned home. The kitchen table sat empty, its surface bearing only faint impressions where the images had rested. No signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside, but the metallic smell hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. I called the detective, but his phone had been disconnected. Directory assistants had no listing for his name. When I drove to the diner where we'd met, the staff claimed they'd never seen him before. The waitress who'd served us our coffee looked at me with genuine confusion when I described his appearance. The chiming became constant, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to originate from inside my skull. I began to question whether anyone else had ever heard it, or if it existed only in my deteriorating perception of reality. Sleep became impossible. Food tasted like metal and ash. The familiar spaces of my home felt foreign and threatening. I found myself driving past the houses of people who disappeared, studying the windows and doorways where the photographs had been taken. Some of the buildings had been demolished, replaced by newer constructions that bore no resemblance to the original structures, but others remained unchanged, as if frozen in time at the moment their occupants had vanished. At one location, I noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth beneath a window. The prints were small, narrow, possibly made by a woman's shoe. They led from the street to the house, then disappeared at the foundation, as if someone had simply walked through the wall. The chiming stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete that I wondered if I'd gone deaf. But then I heard it, a voice, soft and familiar, calling my name from somewhere inside the house. My sister's voice, though I knew she was gone. I followed the sound through rooms that seemed to stretch and distort around me. The voice led me to the basement, where I found a door that hadn't existed before. Beyond it, a staircase descended into darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight's beam. The photographs were there, arranged on tables like exhibits in a museum. But these weren't the same images I'd found in my grandmother's house. These showed me, walking to my car, entering buildings, sleeping in my bed. Hundreds of photographs documenting every moment of my life from angles I'd never considered. And there in the corner of the room sat my sister. Her eyes were open but empty, staring at nothing. She breathed in perfect rhythm with the chiming that had returned, soft and persistent. 7 beats, then silence. 7 beats, then silence. I reached for her, but my hand passed through empty air. She was there and not there, present and absent, real and impossible. Like the photographs themselves, existing in a space between truth and fiction, where nothing could be trusted and everything might be lies. The chiming continues now, marking time in a rhythm only I can hear. I've stopped trying to understand its meaning or source. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some truths are too large and terrible to comprehend. I know they're watching me. I can feel their presence in every shadow, every reflection, every moment of supposed solitude. The photographs continue to accumulate, documenting a life that may not be entirely my own. And sometimes, when the chiming grows particularly loud, I wonder if I'm the one taking them. Story 4. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft patterns on the living room floor. A faint aroma of brewed coffee lingered, teasing the senses with its comforting promise. Yet the old grandfather clock emitted erratic ticks as though struggling against the grip of an unseen hand. Dust motes swirled lazily in the air, disturbed by a draft from the attic door, which stood ajar despite being perpetually shut. As the house settled around me, an unsettling weight seemed to press against the walls, whispering secrets that dared not be spoken. The nausea comes first, always the nausea, thick and metallic, coating my throat like I've swallowed pennies. My hands shake as I reach for the coffee cup, and I notice the tremor has become constant now, a rhythmic betrayal of my nervous system. The liquid tastes wrong, bitter beyond reason, and I wonder if I remember to add sugar or if my taste buds have simply forgotten how to process comfort. There's something about that attic door that pulls at the edges of my consciousness. I know I closed it. I always close it. The latch clicks with a satisfying finality that I've come to depend on, yet here it stands, gaping like a mouth caught mid-scream. The draft carries more than just cool air. It brings whispers of something I've been trying to forget. My sister used to say I had an overactive imagination. She would laugh when I insisted the house breathed at night, when I claimed the walls expanded and contracted with some hidden pulse. But she isn't laughing anymore. She isn't doing much of anything anymore, come to think of it. When did I last see her? The memory feels slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. The phone rang 3 times yesterday, or was it the day before? Time has become elastic, stretching and compressing without my permission. Each ring cut through the silence like a blade, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. The caller ID displayed a number I recognized but couldn't place, digits that seemed familiar yet foreign, like a word repeated until it loses all meaning. I remember her hair first, always her hair, the way it caught light even in darkness, how it smelled of that expensive shampoo she insisted on buying despite our tight budget. She would brush it exactly 100 times before bed, counting aloud in that sing-song voice that made me want to scream and laugh simultaneously. The brush sits on the bathroom counter still, strands of gold and amber tangled in its bristles like evidence of something I can't quite name. The basement door creaks when the house settles. It's an old house, prone to shifting and sighing, but this particular creak has developed a pattern that sounds almost conversational. 3 short groans followed by a long, drawn-out complaint. Sometimes I find myself responding, nodding along as if engaged in dialogue with the architecture itself. She had a way of tilting her head when she was thinking, a small gesture that made her look like a curious bird. I catch myself doing it now, feel the muscles in my neck pull in that same direction, and wonder when I started mimicking her mannerisms. The mirror in the hallway reflects someone I don't entirely recognize, features that seem to shift depending on the angle of observation. The coffee grows cold in my hands, but I can't remember lifting the cup. My reflection in the dark liquid shows eyes that appear hollow, pupils dilated despite the morning brightness. There's a stain on my shirt that I don't recall making, rust-colored and roughly the size of a thumbprint. I touch it absently and feel the fabric's stiffness, as if something has dried there and been washed repeatedly without success. The neighbors stopped waving. I noticed it gradually, the way their friendly gestures became perfunctory nods, then averted gazes, then nothing at all. They whisper behind their perfectly manicured hedges, voices carrying just enough to let me know I'm the subject without revealing the content. Their children no longer retrieve balls that land in my yard. I found a note in my handwriting that I don't remember composing. The words seemed familiar yet foreign, written in my characteristic scrawl but expressing thoughts I couldn't claim as my own. It mentioned an appointment, a meeting I had no recollection of scheduling. The paper felt strange between my fingers, too smooth, too white, as if it had been bleached of more than just color. The attic calls to me with increasing frequency. I feel its pull like a physical force, a magnetic attraction that makes my feet turn toward the stairs without conscious decision. The steps creak in an ascending scale, each board contributing its own note to a melody I've begun to recognize. The air grows thicker as I climb, heavy with the weight of accumulated secrets. She used to sing while cooking, voice carrying through the house like a benediction. The kitchen still holds echoes of those songs, phantom melodies that seem to emanate from the walls themselves. I catch fragments sometimes, half-remembered lyrics that dissolve when I try to focus on them. The recipe cards remain in her handwriting, ingredients listed in that careful script I once found so endearing. The police officer had kind eyes. I remember that distinctly, how they crinkled at the corners when he smiled, trying to put me at ease. His questions seemed reasonable at the time, routine inquiries delivered in a gentle tone that made them feel like casual conversation. Only later did I realize how carefully constructed they were, how each one built upon the last to create a framework I hadn't noticed being assembled around me. My hands feel foreign lately, as if they belong to someone else. I watch them move through daily tasks with a detachment that's both fascinating and terrifying. They know things I don't remember teaching them, reach for objects in places I don't recall storing them. Sometimes I catch them trembling for no apparent reason, a palsy that seems to have its own agenda. The garden tells stories I'm not sure I want to hear. The soil appears disturbed in places where I don't remember digging, dark patches that seem to absorb rather than reflect light. The roses have grown wild, their blooms too red, too perfect, as if they're feeding on something richer than fertilizer. I avoid that corner of the yard now, though I can't articulate why. Sleep brings dreams that feel more like memories, and memories that seem more like dreams. The boundaries have blurred until I can no longer distinguish between what happened and what I feared might happen. Her voice echoes through both states, sometimes comforting, sometimes accusatory, always just beyond the reach of clear understanding. The basement holds boxes I don't remember packing, items wrapped in newspaper whose headlines speak of events I can't place in my personal timeline. Each box feels heavier than its contents should warrant, as if gravity works differently on objects touched by certain kinds of knowledge. I've stopped going down there altogether. The phone rings again, that same unidentified number pulsing across the screen like a heartbeat. My finger hovers over the answer button, but something in my chest constricts, a physical warning that makes me hesitate until the ringing stops. The silence that follows feels loaded with possibility and threat in equal measure. I remember the weight of the shovel in my hands, how the handle felt worn smooth by countless previous uses. The blade bit into earth with a satisfying chunk that reverberated up through my arms and into my chest. I told myself I was planting roses, preparing the ground for something beautiful, but the hole seemed deeper than necessary for any flower. The mirror reflects a stranger wearing my face, someone whose eyes hold knowledge I can't access but can't escape. The reflection moves a fraction of a second behind my actual movements, creating a disorienting lag that makes me question which version is real. I've started avoiding mirrors altogether, but they seem to multiply, appearing in unexpected places throughout the house. Her laughter still echoes in empty rooms, a sound that once brought joy but now carries undertones I can't identify. It comes at odd moments, triggered by nothing I can perceive, as if the house itself remembers her presence and occasionally forgets she's gone. The sound makes my skin crawl even as it breaks my heart. The attic door swings open again, that persistent invitation I continue to resist. The darkness beyond seems to pulse with its own rhythm, a breathing quality that suggests life in places where life shouldn't exist. Sometimes I think I hear movement up there, soft footsteps across boards that should creak under any weight. I find myself standing in places without remembering the journey, appearing in rooms as if I've been sleepwalking through my own life. The kitchen, the basement stairs, the garden gate, all become destinations I reach without conscious navigation. My feet seem to know paths my mind hasn't chosen to take. The detective's business card sits on my desk, edges worn from handling, though I don't recall touching it repeatedly. The numbers have become familiar through repetition, digits I could dial from memory, though I've never used them. Sometimes I pick up the phone and start to call, but my fingers freeze before completing the connection. Her perfume lingers in impossible places, rooms she rarely entered, clothes I know I've washed multiple times. The scent appears without warning, a sensory ghost that stops me mid-step and floods my consciousness with associations I can't quite grasp. It's strongest near the basement door, that persistent floral note threading through the musty air. The neighbors' whispers have grown bolder, conversations that pause when I appear and resume when they think I'm out of earshot. Their words drift through open windows, fragments that piece together into a narrative I don't recognize but can't dismiss. They speak of things I don't remember doing, events I can't place in my personal history. I discovered muddy footprints leading from the back door to the basement, tracks that appeared overnight like evidence of a sleepwalker's journey. The pattern suggests someone carrying a heavy burden, steps uneven and widely spaced as if struggling with an awkward load. I clean them away, but they return the next morning, following the same path with disturbing precision. The grandfather clock has developed a stutter, its mechanism catching on something invisible that disrupts the steady rhythm I once found comforting. The irregular ticking creates a syncopated beat that seems to echo the arrhythmic pounding of my heart when anxiety spikes without apparent cause. I've stopped winding it, but it continues running anyway. Memory plays tricks in the space between waking and sleeping, those liminal moments when consciousness shifts gears and truth becomes negotiable. I see her face in that twilight state, expression changing from love to fear to something I can't name. Her mouth moves as if speaking, but no sound emerges, leaving me to guess at words that might explain everything or nothing. The roses have grown too tall, their stems reaching toward windows with an urgency that seems almost deliberate. Their thorns catch clothing and skin when I pass too close, as if they're trying to keep me from leaving, to hold me in place for some purpose I can't fathom. The blooms watch like eyes, tracking movement with impossible awareness. I found her journal hidden behind books I never read, pages filled with handwriting that grows increasingly erratic toward the end. The entries speak of fears I didn't know she harbored, suspicions about me that make my chest tight with something between grief and guilt. The final entry cuts off mid-sentence, pen trailing across the page as if abandoned in haste. The police officer returns in dreams, his kind eyes now holding questions I can't answer and accusations I can't refute. His voice carries the weight of authority even in sleep, asking about timelines I can't reconstruct and alibis I can't provide. I wake with his words echoing in my ears, fragments of interrogation that feel more like prophecy than memory. The attic door stands open again, and this time I don't close it. The darkness beyond seems less threatening now, more like an invitation than a threat. I can hear something up there, a sound like breathing or perhaps like settling, the house exhaling secrets it can no longer contain. My feet find the first step before my mind decides to climb. Story 5. Cold metal met my palm, unmoving, still. The handle should have turned as it always did, but it stayed fixed, as if the day had refused to start. The clock on the wall ticked backward in a familiar rhythm, confusing morning for night. Outside, the world held its breath, and shadows on the floor merged and separated in a silent dance. A routine, disrupted, whispered of an unseen presence. When the sound of my shoes scraped the floor, I realized the echo came a second too soon. Something had returned, or perhaps it had never left. I remember standing there, my hand still pressed against that door handle, wondering when the certainty had begun to slip away. The feeling wasn't new, it had been building like sediment in still water, layer upon layer of small disturbances that individually meant nothing, but together formed something I couldn't name. The house breathed around me, settling into its familiar groans and whispers, but there was something else now, something that made me question whether I was truly alone. The photographs on the hallway table had been rearranged. I noticed this 3 weeks before the door handle incident, though I'm not certain why I'm measuring time in relation to that morning. Perhaps because it was the moment I stopped pretending the changes were coincidental. The wedding photo, mine, from years ago, had been moved 2 inches to the left. The frame that held my graduation picture now sat where the wedding photo should have been. Such small adjustments, barely perceptible, yet they transformed the entire arrangement into something foreign. I called out that morning, my voice echoing through rooms that felt larger than they had the day before. No response came, but I hadn't expected one. The silence that followed was different from ordinary quiet. It had weight, presence, as if someone had just finished speaking and their words still hung in the air, invisible but tangible. The coffee maker had been programmed differently. I discovered this detail weeks later when I was retracing my steps, trying to identify the moment when normal became something else. The timer had been set for 3 minutes earlier than usual. 3 minutes that created a gap between expectation and reality, a small fracture in routine that made me question my own memory. Had I changed it myself? The uncertainty felt like standing on shifting ground. My neighbor mentioned seeing lights in my house during the hours I knew I was away. She brought this up casually while we both collected mail from the cluster of boxes at the street corner. Her words were innocent enough, wrapped in the kind of small talk that fills empty moments between acquaintances, but they lodged themselves in my mind, growing heavier with each repetition. I began leaving markers when I went out, a book placed just so on the kitchen counter, a towel folded in a specific way. Upon returning, these objects remained undisturbed, yet the house felt different, as if the air itself had been rearranged. The basement door creaked differently. This sound had become the soundtrack to my evenings, a subtle variation in pitch that suggested the hinges had been used more frequently than usual. I would lie in bed, listening to the house settle, trying to distinguish between normal sounds and the others, the ones that seemed to have no source. Footsteps that could have been the building's natural expansion, or perhaps something else entirely. I started keeping a journal, though I hesitate to call it that. More accurately, it became a collection of observations, fragments of doubt written in margins of grocery lists and on the backs of envelopes. The handwriting looked strange to me sometimes, as if I had written these notes in a different state of mind. One entry, discovered tucked inside a cookbook I rarely used, simply read, "The windows watch differently now." I have no memory of writing these words, yet the script was undeniably mine. Sleep became elusive, not from fear, but from a kind of hypervigilance that kept my senses alert to every shift in the house's rhythm. I would wake to find myself listening, though for what I couldn't say. The refrigerator's hum seemed louder, the heating system cycling more irregular. These mechanical sounds, once comforting in their predictability, had become unpredictable, following patterns I couldn't decode. The mail began arriving at different times. This detail seems insignificant now, but then it felt like another piece of evidence that something fundamental had shifted. The postal worker, when I finally asked, claimed nothing had changed in his route or schedule. Yet I would find myself waiting by the window at the usual time, watching an empty street, only to discover letters and bills had somehow appeared hours earlier or later than expected. My reflection in the bathroom mirror caught my attention one morning not because it looked different, but because it appeared a fraction of a second before I expected it to. Such a small delay, barely perceptible, yet it made me question whether I was seeing myself or someone else who happened to look exactly like me. I began avoiding mirrors, not from vanity or fear, but from the unsettling sense that my own image had become unreliable. The telephone rang at unusual hours, calls that ended before I could answer. The caller ID displayed numbers I didn't recognize, sequences of digits that seemed almost familiar but remained just beyond the edge of memory. When I tried calling these numbers back, I reached disconnected lines or businesses that claimed no knowledge of any outgoing calls. These conversations left me feeling as though I had asked the wrong questions, but I couldn't determine what the right ones might be. Books in my library had been opened to different pages. I noticed this while searching for a recipe, finding volumes I rarely touched now displaying passages that seemed to speak directly to my situation. A mystery novel lay open to a chapter about hidden watchers. A biography revealed a page discussing the nature of paranoia. A collection of poetry showed verses about the thin line between reality and imagination. These discoveries felt too convenient to be coincidental, yet too subtle to be deliberate messages. The grocery store clerk mentioned that someone had been asking about my shopping habits. This information came to me third-hand through a friend who knew the clerk's sister, so its reliability remained questionable. According to this chain of communication, a person had inquired about what I typically purchased, what days I usually shopped, whether I always came alone. The description of this inquirer varied depending on who told the story, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, always vague enough to be anyone or no one. I began taking different routes to familiar destinations, not from any conscious decision, but from an instinct I couldn't name. Streets I had traveled for years suddenly felt foreign, as if the landscape itself had been subtly altered. Traffic lights seemed to change at different intervals. Construction appeared on roads that had been clear the day before. Familiar businesses bore signs I didn't remember seeing. These changes were always small enough to doubt, never dramatic enough to confirm. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, though I never caught sight of any watcher. It was a feeling that settled between my shoulder blades, a weight that suggested eyes following my movements. I would turn suddenly, hoping to catch someone in the act of observation, but found only empty spaces where I expected to see a figure. This absence felt more significant than any presence would have been. My handwriting began to change, becoming more careful, more deliberate, as if I were writing for an audience other than myself. Shopping lists turned into formal documents, casual notes took on the tone of official reports. I found myself explaining my actions on paper, justifying decisions that needed no justification, creating records of activities that were perfectly ordinary, yet felt somehow significant enough to document. The house's temperature fluctuated in ways that couldn't be explained by weather or mechanical failure. Rooms would become suddenly cold, then return to normal before I could locate the source of the change. The heating system showed no signs of malfunction. The windows remained properly sealed, yet these temperature shifts continued, creating microclimates of discomfort that moved through the house like invisible currents. Conversations with friends and family became strained, not because they noticed anything different about me, but because I found myself listening for hidden meanings in their words. Casual comments about my appearance, my behavior, my schedule began to sound like coded messages or subtle warnings. I would replay these conversations in my mind, searching for patterns that probably didn't exist, finding significance in pauses and emphasis that were likely imaginary. The garden showed signs of disturbance. Plants moved slightly from their original positions, soil that looked as though it had been carefully replaced after being dug up and examined. These changes were so minor that I questioned my own perception, wondering if I was remembering the garden incorrectly, or if someone had indeed been exploring my property with surgical precision. The uncertainty was more unsettling than any definitive proof would have been. Sleep patterns shifted without any conscious decision on my part. I would find myself waking at precise times 3:17, 4:42, 5:58, as if responding to some internal alarm I hadn't set. These wakeful moments were filled with a sense of expectation, as though something important was about to happen or had just finished happening. The house around me felt alive during these hours, more present and aware than it seemed during daylight. Old photographs began appearing in unexpected places, tucked inside books, slipped between couch cushions, left on countertops where I was certain to find them. These weren't pictures I had lost or misplaced, but images I had deliberately stored away, forgotten reminders of people and events I had chosen not to think about. Their reappearance felt like a form of archaeology, as if someone were excavating my past and presenting it back to me in carefully chosen moments. The pattern became clearer as I write this, though clarity might be the wrong word. The disturbances weren't random, they followed a logic I was only beginning to understand. Each small change built upon the previous ones, creating a narrative that was being written around me rather than by me. I had become a character in someone else's story, though I couldn't identify the author or predict the ending. My reflection in store windows began to catch my attention, not because it looked wrong, but because it looked too right, too perfectly composed, as if I were unconsciously posing for an invisible photographer. I started avoiding my reflection entirely, taking routes that minimized encounters with reflective surfaces, but this avoidance only made me more aware of how many surfaces in the modern world can throw back an image. The realization came gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape I thought I knew. The changes, the disturbances, the sense of being observed, they weren't separate incidents, but parts of a larger pattern, a careful orchestration that had been building around me for longer than I had initially understood. Someone had been studying me, learning my routines, my habits, my responses, with the patience of a scientist and the precision of an artist. But even as this understanding crystallized, doubt crept in from the edges. Was I seeing patterns because they existed, or because my mind needed them to exist? The line between observation and paranoia had become so thin that I could no longer distinguish between them. Every piece of evidence could be explained away. Every suspicious incident could have an innocent interpretation, yet the overall impression remained. I was not alone in my life. The morning I found the door handle locked, I realized that the investigation had reached its conclusion, though I still didn't know what had been discovered or by whom. Standing there with my palm pressed against cold metal that refused to yield, I understood that this moment had been inevitable, the logical endpoint of a process that had been unfolding around me for longer than I cared to calculate. Now, as I recall that moment, I can still feel the chill of the handle against my skin, the resistance that spoke of change, of boundaries that had been established without my knowledge or consent. The clock continues its backward rhythm, the shadows still dance their silent dance, and somewhere in the space between certainty and doubt, the truth waits, patient and unknowable. Cold metal meets my palm again, unmoving, still, and I wonder if this is how all mysteries end, not with answers, but with the recognition that some questions were never meant to be resolved. Story 6. The clock ticked soft and measured, then faltered, skipping a beat only I seemed to notice. My fingers brushed the countertop where crumbs from breakfast resettled, a pattern misaligned from the day before. Near the doorway, the rug's edge curled slightly upward and unfurling where no feet had passed. In the haze of the morning light, the front door stood ajar, the air beyond too still, too expectant. I reached for the latch without thought, but the door swung shut on its own. The nausea begins there in that moment of the door closing itself. A cold weight settling in my stomach like swallowed stones. I've been carrying this feeling for weeks now, maybe longer. Time has become elastic, stretching and contracting without my permission. The sensation follows me through rooms, clings to my skin like dampness after rain. I remember standing in the kitchen afterward, staring at the coffee maker as it gurgled and hissed. The sound was wrong somehow, too loud, too urgent. My hands shook as I reached for the mug, and I wondered when they had started doing that, the trembling. When had my body begun betraying me with these small rebellions? The woman from next door had been there that morning, or was it the morning before? She stood at my kitchen window, her face pressed close to the glass, breath fogging the pane. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear the words through the barrier. Her eyes were wide, searching. When I blinked, she was gone, leaving only the ghost of her breath on the window. But that's not right either. She couldn't have been at the window. The kitchen faces the back garden, and there's nothing there but the old oak tree with its twisted branches. The tree that drops leaves even when there's no wind. I've watched them fall, single leaves spiraling down in perfect stillness, landing with sounds too heavy for their weight. The phone rang that day, 3 short bursts, then silence. I lifted the receiver but heard only my own breathing echoed back, distorted and strange. Someone was listening. Someone was always listening now. The phone calls had been coming for days, always at the same time, always with that same hollow echo. I started unplugging the phone, but it rang anyway. My reflection in the bathroom mirror has been changing. Subtle shifts that I notice only in peripheral vision. The angle of my jaw, the set of my shoulders. Sometimes I catch myself mid-gesture, my hand raised to my face in a motion I don't remember beginning. The mirror shows me touching my cheek, but I feel nothing beneath my fingers. There was blood under my fingernails that morning, just a trace, dark and dried. I scrubbed at it with the small brush I keep by the sink, watching the water swirl pink down the drain. I couldn't remember cutting myself, couldn't find any wound. My hands were unmarked, pale and smooth as always. The basement door was open when I came upstairs. I always keep it locked, always. The key hangs on a hook by the refrigerator, but when I checked, it was still there, undisturbed. The lock showed no signs of tampering, yet the door stood wide, revealing the darkness below like an open mouth. I descended the stairs without deciding to. My feet found each step with certainty, as if they had made this journey many times before. The basement was different than I remembered, larger. The walls seemed to stretch beyond the reach of the single bulb that swayed overhead. In the far corner sat a chair I didn't recognize, its fabric worn smooth by use. Someone had been sitting there recently. The cushion held the impression of a body, still warm when I pressed my palm against it. But I live alone. I've always lived alone. The house has been empty except for me since I moved in, hasn't it? The photographs on the mantelpiece have been rearranging themselves. I notice it in small increments, a face turned slightly left instead of right, a hand that was resting now raised in greeting. In one picture, I'm standing beside someone who has been carefully cut away, leaving only a shadow and the ghost of an arm around my shoulders. I found the scissors in the kitchen drawer, their blades stained with something that flaked away when I touched it. Photo paper, perhaps, or something else entirely. I held them up to the light, studying the residue, but my vision blurred and I had to sit down suddenly, the room tilting around me. The neighbor woman was real. She had to be real because I remember her voice, the way it cracked when she spoke my name. She was asking about the noise, she said, the noise that had been coming from my house, but I hadn't heard any noise. The house was quiet, so quiet that sometimes I spoke aloud just to break the oppressive silence. She stood on my front porch, her hands twisted together, her eyes darting past me into the hallway. She was afraid of something or someone. Her lips moved quickly, words tumbling over each other in their urgency. Something about seeing lights in windows that should have been dark, about voices carrying across the yard in the deep of night. I told her she was mistaken. I sleep soundly. I've always been a sound sleeper. But even as I spoke, I remembered the mornings when I woke fully dressed, my shoes muddy, my clothes smelling of earth and something else I couldn't identify. The taste in my mouth like copper pennies. The garden behind the house has been disturbed. The soil is loose in patches, darker than it should be. I don't remember planting anything new, but something has been buried there. The earth mounds slightly in a shape that makes my chest tighten with inexplicable dread. I avoid looking at that part of the yard now. I keep the curtains drawn in the kitchen, but sometimes I feel compelled to peek through the gap between the fabric and the window frame. The mounded earth seems to pulse in my peripheral vision, rising and falling like breathing. The woman stopped coming to my door. I realize this now, though I'm not sure when the visits ended. The silence where her voice used to be feels heavier than the silence that came before. I catch myself listening for her footsteps on the porch, her tentative knock, but there's nothing. My dreams have been vivid lately, full of movement and purpose. I wake exhausted, my muscles aching as if I've been working through the night. My clothes are sometimes damp with perspiration, sometimes with something else. Water, perhaps, or dew from walking through wet grass. In these dreams, I'm always moving towards something, a destination that feels urgent, necessary. My hands are busy in these dreams, digging, arranging, covering. I wake with dirt beneath my fingernails, though I scrub them clean each night before bed. The basement chair is occupied more often now. I can sense the presence even from upstairs, a weight in the house that shifts the very air. The floorboards creak in sequences that sound almost like footsteps, but when I investigate, I find nothing. Only the chair, still warm, still holding the shape of whoever was sitting there moments before. I've started talking to the empty house, my voice echoing off the walls in patterns that sound almost like conversation. Sometimes I pause, listening for responses that never come. Or do they? The house seems to breathe around me, sighing through vents and settling into itself with sounds that might be words if I listened carefully enough. The mirror in the bathroom cracked yesterday, a thin line running from the upper left corner to the center, bisecting my reflection when I stand in just the right spot. Through the crack, my face looks different, older, more tired. The eyes that stare back at me hold knowledge I don't remember acquiring. I found her earring under the kitchen table, small, silver, shaped like a teardrop. It wasn't mine. I don't wear jewelry, have never liked the weight of metal against my skin. But there it was, catching the light as if it had been placed there deliberately, waiting to be discovered. The earring was warm when I picked it up, as if it had been worn recently. I held it in my palm, studying its simple elegance, trying to remember where I had seen it before. The memory danced just beyond my grasp, like trying to recall a dream after waking. She had been wearing them that last time she came to the door, both earrings, catching the afternoon light as she turned her head to look past me into the house. Her neck was pale where her hair fell away from it, vulnerable in a way that made something twist in my chest. But I don't remember her leaving. I remember her voice, her urgent questions, her frightened eyes. I remember stepping aside to let her in, her hesitation at the threshold, the way she looked back over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. After that, the memory becomes soft around the edges, blurred like a photograph taken with unsteady hands. The house feels different now, heavier, as if it's holding secrets in its walls, pressing them down into the foundation where they can't escape. I move through the rooms like a ghost, touching surfaces that seem to hold the memory of other hands, other lives. The clock has stopped skipping beats. It ticks with mechanical precision now, marking time that feels both endless and compressed. I watch its hands move and wonder how many moments I've lost, how many gaps exist in my memory like missing pages torn from a book. The basement door stands open again. It's always open now, as if the house itself is breathing through that dark mouth. I no longer bother to close it. The futility of the gesture has become clear to me, though I can't articulate why. Sometimes I stand at the top of the stairs, looking down into that waiting darkness, and I feel a pull like gravity. My feet want to carry me down those steps, back to the chair that holds its patient vigil in the corner, back to whatever truth is waiting there in the shadows. The garden continues to settle. The mounded earth has flattened somewhat, becoming part of the natural landscape. Rain has washed away the obvious signs of disturbance, leaving only a subtle depression that catches water when storms pass through. I've been sleeping better lately. The dreams have faded, replaced by a darkness so complete it feels like floating in space. I wake refreshed but empty, as if something essential has been drained away during the night. The muddy shoes, the damp clothes, the taste of copper, all of these have become memories of memories, distant and unreal. The phone no longer rings. The silence it leaves behind is profound, absolute. I realize now that I had grown accustomed to those hollow echoes, the sense of being observed through the electronic connection. Without them, the house feels truly isolated, cut off from the world beyond its walls. I found myself in the basement yesterday, sitting in the chair without remembering the journey downstairs. The cushions molded themselves to my body as if they had been waiting for my return. From this vantage point, the basement looked different, smaller, more familiar. There was a smell down there, faint but persistent, sweet and earthy, like flowers left too long in water. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the house were slowly decomposing from within. I breathed it in and felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circuit had finally been closed. The woman's face has begun to fade from my memory. I can recall fragments, the curve of her cheek, the way her hands moved when she spoke, but the complete picture eludes me. She's becoming abstract, a collection of sensory impressions rather than a whole person. Her earring still sits on my kitchen counter, a small silver anchor to something that might have been real. I touch it sometimes, rolling it between my fingers, and for a moment the memories sharpen. Her voice becomes clear, her words urgent and afraid, but then the clarity fades, leaving only the weight of the metal and the lingering scent of her perfume. The mirror crack has spread, creating a web of fractures that distort my reflection into fragments. Each piece shows a different angle, a different expression. Together they create a portrait of someone I almost recognize, someone who might have been me before everything changed. I understand now that the house has been teaching me something. Each small disturbance, each unexplained occurrence has been a lesson in accepting what cannot be explained. The basement chair, the rearranging photographs, the door that opens and closes on its own, all of these are simply the house's way of communicating. The nausea has lifted. That cold weight in my stomach has dissolved, replaced by something that might be peace or emptiness. The distinction has become irrelevant. I move through my days with mechanical precision, tending to tasks that feel both familiar and foreign. Sometimes I catch myself listening for footsteps on the porch, for the tentative knock that will never come again. The woman's voice has joined the other sounds the house makes, the creaking and settling and sighing that form the soundtrack of my solitude. She's part of the structure now, woven into the very fabric of this place. The garden has grown lush over the settled earth. New plants have sprouted without being planted, their roots drinking deeply from the enriched soil below. They grow with unusual vigor, their leaves a deeper green than seems natural. I watch them from the kitchen window and feel a satisfaction I can't quite explain. The basement door remains open, but I no longer feel compelled to descend those stairs. The chair waits patiently in its corner, but its purpose has been fulfilled. The house has found its equilibrium, and I am part of that balance now. I realize that memory is more fluid than I once believed. It shifts and changes, adapting itself to present needs. The woman who came to my door, who asked urgent questions about lights and voices, she exists now in a form that serves the house's requirements. Her presence has been integrated, absorbed, transformed into something useful. The photographs on the mantelpiece have settled into their final arrangement. The cutaway figure has been replaced by shadow, and the shadow has become part of the composition. Nothing is missing now. Everything is exactly as it should be. The clock ticks with perfect rhythm, marking moments that flow like water, each one identical to the last. I listen to its voice and understand that time is not linear but circular, each tick a return to the same eternal instant. The door no longer swings open on its own because there is no longer any need for it to do so. I sit in my kitchen as the light fades, watching the garden through glass that holds no reflection. The earring catches the dying light, winking once before darkness claims it. Somewhere in the house, a board creaks with the weight of settling, and I smile because I know that sound now. I know what it means. The house breathes around me, inhaling secrets and exhaling silence. We have reached an understanding. The house and we are no longer separate entities, but parts of a greater whole, connected by threads of memory and earth and the patient accumulation of time. Story 7. Hash the weight of keys. The clock against the wall made no sound, its hands twitching slightly like an itch without relief. The air folded into itself, a veil of warmth where cool used to be, wrapping the room in a strange embrace. Each step I took felt slightly delayed, as if my feet were trailing a moment behind the rest of me. A familiar creak underfoot released a sigh too early, echoing my uncertainty. The keys, always on the hook, rested instead on the floor, untouched and yet rearranged. I picked them up, feeling the tarnished surface, and sensed their weight had shifted. Something had changed in my neighbor's apartment. The woman who lived across the hall had stopped playing her piano. For months, I'd grown accustomed to the gentle melodies drifting through our shared wall each evening, a routine as predictable as sunrise. Now, silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. I held those keys in my palm, running my thumb across their worn edges. She'd given them to me weeks ago, asking if I could water her plants while she visited family. The arrangement felt natural then. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the hallway, brief conversations about weather and weekend plans. She had kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled, though I noticed she often glanced over her shoulder when we spoke. The scent of something sweet and cloying had begun seeping through the walls. Not flowers, not perfume, but something organic that made my stomach turn slightly. I pressed my ear to the shared wall, listening for any sign of life, Nothing, just the steady hum of an air conditioning unit working overtime. I decided to check on her plants. The key turned easily in her lock, but the door resisted, as if something weighed against it from the inside. When it finally gave way, the smell hit me like a physical blow. Sweet decay mixed with the artificial freshness of air freshener, creating a nauseating cocktail that coated the back of my throat. Her apartment mirrored mine in layout, but felt entirely different in atmosphere. Where mine was cluttered with books and half-finished projects, hers maintained an almost sterile cleanliness. Everything in its place, surfaces wiped clean, not a single item out of alignment, except for the plants. They were dead, all of them, brown leaves scattered across windowsills, soiled dry and cracked in their pots. Yet the smell wasn't coming from the dying vegetation. It was deeper, more complex, emanating from somewhere beyond the living room. I called her name softly, not wanting to startle her if she was resting. No response. The silence felt thick, almost tangible, pressing against my skin like humidity before a storm. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against her hardwood floors, each creak announcing my presence to an empty space. The kitchen appeared untouched, dishes clean and stacked, counters spotless, refrigerator humming quietly. But when I opened it to check for spoiled food that might explain the odor, I found it nearly empty. Just a carton of milk, some condiments, and a single takeout container pushed to the back. The milk was still fresh. The takeout container felt cold against my fingers, its contents recently placed. This struck me as odd. If she was visiting family, why was there fresh food in her refrigerator? I moved toward the bedroom, following the increasingly potent smell. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of darkness beyond. I pushed it open with my fingertips, half expecting to find her sleeping, perhaps ill and unable to respond to my calls. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked tight, pillows arranged symmetrically. But the smell was strongest here, seeming to rise from the floorboards themselves. I knelt down, pressing my palm to the wood, feeling for any give or irregularity. Nothing seemed amiss, yet the odor suggested otherwise. A photograph on her nightstand caught my attention. It showed her with a man I didn't recognize, both smiling at the camera. His arm wrapped around her shoulders in a gesture that seemed possessive rather than affectionate. She looked younger in the photo, her smile less guarded than the one I knew from our hallway conversations. I picked up the frame, studying their faces more closely. Something about the man's expression bothered me. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his grip on her shoulder appeared tight enough to leave marks. Behind them, I could make out what looked like a moving truck, boxes stacked in the background. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made my heart skip. I quickly replaced the photograph and moved toward the front door, listening. Someone was climbing the stairs, their pace measured and deliberate. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A key scraped against the lock. I froze, suddenly aware of how my presence here might appear to someone else. Though she'd given me permission to enter, I hadn't expected anyone else to have access. The lock turned, and I heard the same resistance I'd encountered, the door pushing against some invisible obstruction. "Hello," a man's voice, deep and slightly irritated. The door stuck again. I remained silent, pressed against the bedroom wall, hoping he might leave if he thought no one was home. But the door finally gave way, and I heard heavy footsteps entering the apartment. "Honey," he called out, his tone shifting from irritation to something that might have been concern. "You hear?" The footsteps moved through the living room, pausing in the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator open, the rustle of plastic. Then the footsteps approached the bedroom where I was hiding. I had nowhere to go. The bedroom had only one exit, and he was blocking it. My mind raced through possible explanations for my presence, but none seemed adequate. I was trespassing, regardless of the key she'd given me. He appeared in the doorway, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that immediately fixed on me with suspicion. This was the same man from the photograph, though older now, his face harder somehow. "Who are you?" he demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his pocket. "What are you doing in here?" I explained about the keys, about checking on the plants, about being her neighbor. He listened without expression, his gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, he studied me for a long moment before speaking. "She didn't mention going anywhere to me," he said finally. "We had dinner plans. She wouldn't just leave without saying something." This contradicted what she told me about visiting family. I mentioned this, and his expression darkened. "What family?" he asked. "She doesn't have any family left." The smell seemed to grow stronger as we stood there, both of us now aware of its presence, but neither acknowledging it directly. He moved past me to the window, opening it wide, but the fresh air did little to dissipate the odor. "How long has it been like this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the dead plants, the stale air. I told him about the piano music stopping, about not seeing her for several days. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "She's been different lately," he said, more to himself than to me. "Paranoid, talking about people following her, watching the apartment. I thought she was just stressed about work." He moved to her dresser, opening drawers with a familiarity that suggested he'd done this before. His search seemed focused, as if looking for something specific. When he found her jewelry box, he opened it and frowned. "Her grandmother's ring is missing," he said. "She never takes it off." I watched him continue his search, growing increasingly agitated as he failed to find whatever he was looking for. His movements became more aggressive, less careful about replacing items where he'd found them. "Did she seem scared of anything specific?" I asked, trying to understand the situation better. He stopped searching and looked at me directly. "Scared of me mostly. Started changing the locks, wouldn't give me a new key. Said she needed space to think." This admission hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. If she'd changed the locks, how had he gotten in? I glanced at the key in his hand, noting it looked newer than mine, the metal brighter, less worn. "Where did you get that key?" I asked. His jaw tightened, made a copy before she changed the locks. I was worried about her, living alone, acting paranoid. Someone needed to be able to check on her. The justification felt hollow, especially given her apparent desire to keep him out. I began to understand why she might have seemed nervous during our conversations, why she'd glanced over her shoulder. She'd been looking for him. "Maybe we should call someone," I suggested. "If she's missing, the police should know." "She's not missing," he said quickly. "She's just being dramatic. She'll come back when she's ready." But his certainty felt forced, and the smell in the apartment suggested otherwise. I excused myself, claiming I needed to get back to my own place, but really I wanted to put some distance between myself and this man who seemed to know more than he was saying. Back in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. The woman I'd known as my neighbor had been quiet but kind, always polite in our brief interactions. The idea that she'd simply disappeared without explanation didn't align with my impression of her character. I spent the evening researching what I should do. The police wouldn't consider someone missing after just a few days, especially if there was no evidence of foul play. But the smell, the dead plants, the fresh food in an empty apartment, all pointed to something being very wrong. That night I listened carefully to the sounds from her apartment. Occasionally I heard footsteps, the creak of floorboards, the sound of someone moving around. The man had apparently decided to stay, perhaps waiting for her return, or perhaps ensuring that no one else would discover whatever he was hiding. The next morning I decided to do some investigating of my own. I started by talking to other neighbors, asking if they'd seen her recently or knew anything about her plans to visit family. Most barely knew her, describing her as polite but private, someone who kept to herself. But one neighbor, an elderly woman who lived on the floor below, had more to say. She came to see me a few weeks ago, the woman told me, her voice dropping to a whisper. Said she was scared of her boyfriend, that he'd been threatening her. Asked if she could use my phone to call someone because she thought he was monitoring hers. This confirmed my growing suspicions about the man I'd encountered. Did she say what kind of threats? Said he'd told her that if she ever tried to leave him, he'd make sure no one would ever find her. She was shaking when she said it, poor thing. I told her to call the police, but she said they wouldn't believe her because he'd never actually hurt her physically. The woman's account painted a picture of escalating domestic abuse, the kind that often ended in tragedy. I asked if she'd seen the neighbor recently, and she shook her head. Not for over a week, but I've seen him coming and going at all hours. Sometimes I hear sounds from up there, like he's moving furniture or something heavy. The implication made my stomach turn. I thanked the elderly woman and returned to my apartment, trying to decide what to do with this information. I had no concrete evidence of a crime, just suspicions and circumstantial details that might mean nothing. But the smell persisted, growing stronger each day despite the man's efforts to mask it with air fresheners and open windows. And I began to notice other things. The sound of running water at odd hours, as if someone was cleaning extensively. The appearance of cleaning supplies in the building's dumpster, bottles that still contained residue of bleach and other harsh chemicals. I started keeping a journal documenting everything I observed, the times I heard movement in her apartment, the people who came and went, the changes in the smell and the man's behavior. He seemed increasingly agitated, jumping at unexpected sounds, looking over his shoulder when he thought no one was watching. One evening I heard him on the phone, his voice carrying through the thin walls. He was arguing with someone, his tone desperate. "I told you she's fine," he said. "She just needed some time away. No, you can't talk to her right now. She's sleeping." A pause, then, "Look, I'll have her call you back when she's feeling better. Yes, I know it's been a while. She's been sick, okay?" The conversation continued in this vein, with him making increasingly elaborate excuses for her absence. It was clear that people were starting to ask questions, and his explanations were becoming harder to maintain. After the call ended, I heard him moving around the apartment more frantically than usual. Something heavy was being dragged across the floor, followed by the sound of running water and the harsh scrape of something being scrubbed. I couldn't ignore the evidence any longer. Whatever had happened to my neighbor, the man in her apartment was involved, and his behavior suggested he was trying to cover up something serious. The next morning, I called the police. The officers who responded seemed skeptical at first. Missing person cases involving adults were common, and most people turned up within a few days. But when I mentioned the smell, the man's suspicious behavior, and the elderly neighbor's account of threats, their attitude shifted. They knocked on her door and the man answered, appearing disheveled and nervous. I watched from my peephole as they questioned him, noting how his story kept changing. First, she was visiting family. Then she was sick in bed. Finally, he claimed she'd gone away to think about their relationship. The officers asked to search the apartment, and after some hesitation, he agreed. I couldn't see what they found, but I heard their radio crackle to life, urgent voices requesting backup and specialized units. Within an hour, the building was swarming with police, crime scene technicians, and detectives. Yellow tape blocked access to her floor, and residents were asked to remain in their apartments while the investigation proceeded. I never saw the man again after that morning. Through my window, I watched as he was led away in handcuffs, his head down, no longer the confident figure who had confronted me in her bedroom. The investigation continued for days. I heard drilling, the sound of floorboards being removed, the quiet conversations of forensic specialists. The smell that had plagued the building for weeks finally began to dissipate, replaced by the clinical odors of police work. A detective interviewed me extensively about my interactions with both my neighbor and her boyfriend. I shared everything I'd observed and documented, feeling both relieved that I'd spoken up and horrified by what my suspicions had apparently confirmed. The detective was professional but revealed little about what they'd found. "Let's just say your observations were very helpful," she told me. "If more people paid attention to their neighbors the way you did, we might prevent more tragedies." But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt complicit somehow, as if I should have acted sooner, should have recognized the signs of danger before it was too late. The woman who had played piano each evening, who had trusted me with her keys, had been calling for help in the only way she could, and I'd almost missed it entirely. The building felt different after the investigation concluded. Other residents moved out, unable to live with the knowledge of what had happened just down the hall. New tenants moved in, unaware of the apartment's history, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But I still listened for piano music in the evenings, still felt the weight of those keys in my palm, even though I'd returned them to the police as evidence. The silence from her apartment had become permanent, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary interactions mask the most extraordinary dangers. I never learned all the details of what happened to her, how long she'd been gone before I noticed, or whether she'd suffered. The case made brief headlines in local news, another domestic violence tragedy in a world full of them, then faded from public attention. What stayed with me was the realization of how thin the walls are between us, how easily someone can disappear from their own life while the world continues around them, oblivious. My neighbor had tried to protect herself, had reached out for help, had even taken precautions like changing her locks, but in the end, none of it had been enough. The man who killed her had seemed ordinary, even concerned about her welfare when I first met him. His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while concealing such violence was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience. It made me question how well we ever really know the people in our lives, how many secrets hide behind polite smiles and casual conversations. Sometimes I wonder if there were other signs I missed, other opportunities to intervene before it was too late. The weight of those keys had felt different that first evening, but I dismissed it as imagination. Her nervous glances over her shoulder had seemed like quirks of personality rather than genuine fear. The silence of her piano had taken me days to notice, days during which she was already gone. The apartment across the hall remains occupied by new tenants now, a young couple who seem happy and ordinary. They've never asked about the previous resident, and I've never volunteered the information. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear piano music drifting through the walls, and I have to remind myself that it's just my memory playing tricks in the space where tragedy once lived. The keys to that apartment were never replaced. The new tenants have their own set, their own routines, their own secrets. But I still remember the weight of those original keys, still feel responsible for the trust that was placed in me and the life that was lost despite my small efforts to help. In the end, justice was served in the legal sense. The man was convicted, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison for what he'd done. But justice feels incomplete when measured against a life cut short, dreams interrupted, music silenced forever. The weight of those keys remains with me, a reminder that sometimes being a good neighbor means more than just watering plants and exchanging pleasantries. It means paying attention to the silence between the notes, recognizing when something that should be there suddenly isn't, and having the courage to act on suspicions that might save a life. Even when, as in this case, that action comes too late to save the person who needed it most. Story 8. The weight of silence. The door didn't shift when I pushed. My palm pressed firmly against the surface, fully anticipating the usual sway, but it remained obstinately still. As I moved through the hallway, the carpet beneath my feet gave no sound, its fibers absorbing everything as if swallowing my presence. The air carried an unfamiliar thickness, an expectation hanging just beyond reach. I paused, sensing the absence of a familiar draft against my skin, a chill that always greeted me here. I reached out to touch the wall, expecting the cool texture of paint, but it felt oddly warm, as though someone had been leaning there just moments before. I had come here because of the letter, not a formal document, but a handwritten note that arrived without ceremony, slipped under my door while I slept. The paper felt substantial between my fingers, heavier than ordinary stationery, with an almost waxy texture that left a faint residue on my skin. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, each letter formed with the precision of someone trying to disguise their natural script. You knew her better than anyone, it read. You should know what really happened. Her, the word carried weight I wasn't prepared to bear. I folded the letter and placed it in my jacket pocket, where it seemed to pulse against my ribs with each heartbeat. The apartment felt different now, charged with the electricity of unfinished business. I had known her, that much was true. We shared the same building, the same routine of checking mailboxes and nodding politely in the elevator. She lived 3 floors above me, in the corner unit with windows facing east. I knew this because I had watched her silhouette moving behind thin curtains during those restless nights when sleep refused to come. Not watching in any intrusive way, but simply noticing the rhythm of another life existing parallel to my own. The police had called it an accident, a tragic slip in the bathroom, they said. These things happen more often than people realize, especially to those living alone. The detective who knocked on doors throughout the building spoke in measured tones, his questions routine and perfunctory. Had we noticed anything unusual, any strange visitors or disturbances? The residents shook their heads in unison, eager to return to the comfort of their private worlds. But I had noticed something. The memory surfaced now as I stood in that strangely warm hallway, my fingers still pressed against the wall. The night before they found her, I had heard music coming from her apartment. Not loud music, but the soft, melancholic kind that seeps through walls and settles in your bones. classical pieces that seemed to repeat the same haunting melody over and over, as if the record was skipping or someone was replaying the same section endlessly. The music stopped abruptly sometime before dawn. I remember lying in bed waiting for it to resume, but silence stretched through the remaining hours until morning light filtered through my blinds. When the ambulance arrived later that day, its red lights painting the building's facade in urgent strokes, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I began my own investigation without consciously deciding to do so. It started with small observations, details that seemed insignificant until they accumulated into a pattern. The building's superintendent mentioned that her apartment key had been returned to the office, though no one could recall who had brought it. The mailman noted that her box had been emptied regularly, even after the incident, until someone from the family finally came to collect her belongings. The family, a distant cousin who arrived wearing a black coat that smelled of mothballs and spoke in hushed tones about funeral arrangements. She spent 2 days clearing out the apartment, carrying boxes to a rental truck with methodical efficiency. I watched from my window as she made trip after trip, her movements precise and emotionless. On her final journey, she paused at the building's entrance and looked up, her gaze sweeping across the windows until it found mine. We stared at each other for a long moment before she climbed into the truck and drove away. That night I found myself standing outside her apartment door. The hallway held the lingering scent of cleaning supplies, sharp and chemical, masking something underneath that I couldn't identify. I pressed my ear to the door and heard nothing, but the silence felt active, as if the space beyond was holding its breath. I discovered the key 3 days later. It had been taped to the underside of the mailbox in the lobby, secured with clear tape that had yellowed slightly around the edges. My fingers trembled as I peeled it away, the metal warm against my palm as if it had been recently handled. No one else seemed to notice as I slipped it into my pocket, though I felt exposed, certain that my actions were being observed and catalogued. The apartment welcomed me with stale air and the persistent odor of disinfectant. Everything had been removed except for the basic fixtures and a few items that had apparently been overlooked or deemed worthless. A coffee mug sat in the sink, its interior stained brown and crusted with residue. The bathroom where she had allegedly fallen showed no signs of the incident, its surfaces scrubbed clean and gleaming under the fluorescent light. But it was in the bedroom that I found the first real clue. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the window was a small metal box, the kind used to store important documents. Inside, I discovered photographs, letters, and a journal bound in cracked leather. The photographs showed her with various people in social settings, but one face appeared repeatedly. A man with kind eyes and a nervous smile, someone who stood close to her in every image, his hand always touching her shoulder or arm in gestures of casual intimacy. The journal entries painted a different picture than the one I had constructed from distant observations. She wrote about fear, about feeling watched and followed. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence or pressed so hard into the paper that they tore through to the next page. "He knows where I live now," read one entry. "I see him in the lobby sometimes, pretending to check his mail, but his box is always empty. He watches the elevator buttons to see which floor I press." Another entry dated just weeks before her death. "The music helps me sleep, but I have to keep it low. He complained to the management about noise, though I know he's lying. He wants any excuse to make contact to force interaction. The classical pieces remind me of better times when I felt safe in my own space." The final entry was brief, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. "I changed the locks, but someone has been in my apartment. Small things moved just enough to let me know. The coffee mug was in the wrong cabinet, my books rearranged. He's playing games and I don't know how to make it stop. I closed the journal and sat on the bare floor, my back against the wall where her bed had once stood. The photographs scattered around me told a story of gradual isolation, the group shots giving way to images of her alone, her smile becoming forced and brittle. In the most recent pictures, she appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, her beauty diminished by what looked like chronic exhaustion. The man with the kind eyes and nervous smile appeared in fewer and fewer photos as time progressed, but when he did appear, his demeanor had changed. His smile seemed predatory now, his proximity to her more possessive than affectionate. In the final photograph, taken in what looked like the building's lobby, he stood partially hidden behind a pillar, his eyes fixed on her retreating figure with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I spent hours in that empty apartment, searching for additional evidence and trying to piece together the timeline of her final weeks. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant hum of traffic. As darkness fell outside the east-facing windows, I began to understand why she had played music to fill the oppressive quiet. The building's rental records, which I accessed through a combination of charm and mild deception at the management office, revealed that the man from the photographs had indeed lived here. His lease had terminated abruptly, just days after her death, with no forwarding address provided. The superintendent remembered him as quiet and polite, the kind of tenant who never caused problems or drew attention to himself. Kept to himself mostly, she told me as we stood in the lobby, her keys jangling softly as she sorted through them. Though he did ask a lot of questions about the other residents, said he was writing a book about urban living, wanted to understand how people connected in apartment buildings. Seemed harmless enough, but something about him made me uncomfortable. Can't put my finger on what exactly. I pressed for more details, and she glanced around nervously before continuing. He had a way of showing up whenever anyone was in distress, like he could sense vulnerability. When that poor girl upstairs started having trouble, he was always there, offering to help with groceries or walk her to her car. At first it seemed sweet, but then it felt like he was always around, always watching. The picture that emerged was of a man who had insinuated himself into her life gradually, presenting himself as a concerned neighbor and potential romantic interest. The photograph suggested that she had initially welcomed his attention, but something had shifted. The journal entries chronicled her growing unease, her recognition that his helpfulness had transformed into something more sinister. I began to notice things about my own apartment that I had previously overlooked. Scratches around the lock that could have been from inexpert key usage. A faint outline on the dust-covered table where something had been moved and replaced. The coffee mug in my kitchen, positioned differently than I remembered leaving it. These observations could have been paranoia, the result of immersing myself too deeply in someone else's tragedy, but they felt significant, part of a pattern that extended beyond a single victim. The local library became my research headquarters, its computers allowing me to search through newspaper archives and public records without leaving digital footprints on my personal devices. I discovered that similar incidents had occurred in other buildings throughout the area, always involving young women living alone, always ruled accidental or natural causes. The deaths were spaced far enough apart and occurred in different jurisdictions, preventing anyone from recognizing the pattern. But there was a pattern. Each victim had reported feeling watched or followed in the weeks before their death. Each had mentioned a helpful neighbor or new acquaintance who had recently entered their lives, and in each case, this person had disappeared shortly after the incident, leaving behind canceled leases and disconnected phone numbers. The weight of this knowledge settled on my chest like a stone. I carried photocopied articles and printed records in a manila folder that grew thicker each day, the evidence accumulating but leading nowhere concrete. The man from the photographs remained a ghost, his identity carefully obscured and his current whereabouts unknown. I started paying closer attention to my fellow building residents, studying their faces and mannerisms for signs of recognition or guilt. The elderly woman who collected her mail at the same time each morning, the young professional who always wore headphones and avoided eye contact, the maintenance worker who had access to every apartment and moved through the building like he belonged in its hidden spaces. Any of them could be him or none of them. The uncertainty gnawed at me, transforming routine interactions into exercises in suspicion and analysis. I found myself memorizing details about my neighbors' schedules and habits, creating mental maps of their movements and vulnerabilities. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was beginning to exhibit the same behaviors I had identified in the predator I sought. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the building's security footage obtained through a carefully crafted story about a missing package, I noticed something that had been overlooked by the police investigation. In the hours before her death, the cameras had captured a figure in the hallway outside her apartment. The person was dressed in maintenance coveralls and carried a toolbox, their face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over their features. But it wasn't the disguise that caught my attention. It was the way the figure moved, with a slight limp that favored the left leg. I had seen that same distinctive gait before, in the building's lobby and stairwells, belonging to someone who had every reason to be there and access to every apartment. The maintenance worker, the one who fixed leaky faucets and changed burnt-out bulbs, who carried master keys and knew which residents worked late or traveled frequently. He had been invisible, a fixture so familiar that no one questioned his presence or remembered seeing him in specific places at specific times. I watched him now with new eyes, noting how he lingered near certain apartments and seemed to know more about the residents' personal lives than his job required. He spoke to the young women in the building with particular attention, offering services they hadn't requested and finding reasons to extend conversations. His smile was kind, his manner helpful and unassuming. Just like the man in the photographs. The realization hit me with physical force, a rush of adrenaline that left my hands shaking and my vision sharp with clarity. I had been living in the same building as a killer, passing him in hallways and nodding politely while he selected his next victim. The thought of how close I had come to danger, how many times I had been alone with him in elevators or stairwells, made my stomach clench with retroactive fear. But with the knowledge came responsibility. I couldn't go to the police with circumstantial evidence and suspicions based on a distinctive walk and access to master keys. I needed proof, something concrete that would link him to her death and the others I suspected he had caused. The weight of that requirement pressed against my conscience, because I knew that gathering such proof would require me to take risks I wasn't certain I was prepared to face. I began documenting his movements, photographing him when possible, and recording the times and locations of our encounters. I researched his employment history and discovered that he had worked at several apartment complexes throughout the area, always leaving his positions shortly after unexplained incidents involving female residents. The pattern was there, clear and undeniable, but still circumstantial. The folder of evidence grew heavier, both literally and metaphorically. I carried it with me everywhere, afraid to leave it unattended in my apartment where he might find it during one of his maintenance visits. The paranoia that had consumed her in her final weeks now infected my own thoughts, transforming my home into a space that felt violated and unsafe. I started staying elsewhere, sleeping on friends' couches and working from coffee shops, always moving and never establishing a predictable routine. But even as I took these precautions, I knew that he was aware of my investigation. Small signs appeared in my apartment despite my absence. Books moved, papers disturbed, the faint impression of someone having sat in my chair. He was playing the same game with me that he had played with her, letting me know that he could reach me whenever he chose. The knowledge that I was being stalked by someone I now believed to be a serial killer should have terrified me into inaction, but instead, it fueled my determination to expose him before he claimed another victim. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. While searching through her personal effects one last time, I discovered a small recording device hidden inside a book. She had been documenting her own stalking, creating an audio diary of the harassment she endured. Her voice, thin and frightened, described encounters that painted a clear picture of systematic psychological torture. "He was in my apartment again today," she whispered into the device. "I know because he moved the coffee mug to the wrong cabinet just like before. He wants me to know he can get in whenever he wants, that the locks don't matter. I'm so tired of being afraid, but I don't know what else to do. The police think I'm paranoid, and maybe I am, but I know what I know." The recording continued for several entries, her voice growing weaker and more desperate with each passage. In the final entry, made just hours before her death, she spoke with the calm resignation of someone who had accepted their fate. "If something happens to me, I want people to know it wasn't an accident. He told me today that accidents happen to people who don't know when to stop asking questions. I think he means to hurt me, but I can't prove it, and no one believes me. I'm leaving this recording where someone might find it, hoping that maybe it will help catch him before he does this to someone else." The recording ended there, but it was enough. Combined with the photographs, journal entries, and security footage, it painted a clear picture of premeditated murder disguised as accidental death. I had the evidence I needed, but I also had the terrifying knowledge that I was now in the same position she had been in, alone with dangerous information and a killer who knew I possessed it. I made copies of everything and stored them in multiple locations, then prepared to contact the authorities. But as I reached for my phone to make the call that would hopefully end his killing spree, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Slow, deliberate steps that paused at my door. A soft knock echoed through the silence, followed by a familiar voice calling my name. The maintenance worker here for an unscheduled visit, his tone friendly and concerned. He knew I had discovered his secret, and he had come to silence me just as he had silenced her. I stood frozen in my living room, the evidence folder clutched against my chest, listening to him try the door handle and finding it locked. The scratching sound of metal against metal told me he was using his master key, the same key that had given him access to her apartment and allowed him to stage her death. The lock clicked open and the door swung inward with the same resistance I had felt in that strange, warm hallway of my memory. He stepped inside, his kind smile intact, but his eyes cold and calculating. In his hand, he carried the same toolbox I had seen in the security footage, its contents now taking on a sinister significance. "I think we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him and turning the deadbolt with practiced efficiency. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately, and I'm concerned that you might have gotten the wrong impression about some recent events." I backed toward the window, my mind racing through possible escape routes and survival strategies. The evidence folder felt heavy in my hands, its weight representing not just the truth about his crimes, but also my only hope of justice for his victims. Whatever happened next, I had to ensure that the information survived, even if I didn't. The story ends here not because justice was served or the killer was caught, but because some truths are too dangerous to fully reveal. The evidence exists, hidden in places where it might someday be found by someone braver or more capable than I proved to be. The pattern continues, moving from building to building, city to city, leaving behind a trail of accidents and coincidences that no one connects. He's still out there, wearing his kind smile and carrying his toolbox, helping vulnerable people with their problems while creating new ones. And somewhere, in an apartment building not unlike the one where this story began, another person is starting to notice that things aren't quite right, that the helpful maintenance worker knows a little too much about their personal life. The door doesn't shift when they push it, and the hallway carpet swallows their footsteps as they move toward a truth they're not prepared to face. The cycle begins again, and I can only hope that the next person to find themselves in this position will be stronger, smarter, or luckier than those who came before. The weight of silence presses against us all, but some silences are more dangerous than others. Story 9. The clock ticked once, then twice, skipping the minutes in between. Every object was an echo, misplaced, a book slightly tilted, a cup turned 90 degrees from its usual rest. I walked the familiar path to the door, but the floor creaked out of sequence, each step a discordant note. The scent of burnt toast lingered from the morning before, yet I hadn't made any today. Fingers brushed the light switch. The room stayed dim, a shadow of yesterday's brightness lurking. In the reflection, a table stood emptier than its counterpart in my mind. The door should have been closed, yet there it was, ajar. I know what happened that night. The sequence of events plays in my mind like a well-rehearsed performance, each detail crisp and logical. My housemate had been acting strangely for weeks, disappearing for hours, returning with dirt under their fingernails and a distant look that made conversation feel like speaking through glass. The phone calls that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. The way they'd stare at the basement door, keys jangling nervously in their pocket. That evening I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from another sleepless night of wondering what was happening in our shared space. Around midnight, I heard the familiar creak of footsteps moving toward the kitchen. Then the soft click of the basement door opening. Nothing unusual there. We stored extra supplies downstairs, and my housemate often worked late on projects I never quite understood. But then came the dragging sound, something heavy being pulled across the concrete floor below. I lay still, counting my breaths, telling myself it was furniture being rearranged or boxes being moved. The dragging stopped. Silence stretched like a held breath until the basement door clicked shut again. Footsteps returned upstairs, paused outside my bedroom door for what felt like an eternity, then continued to their room. In the morning, my housemate was gone. A hastily scrawled note on the kitchen counter explained they'd taken a job in another state, had to leave immediately, would send for their things later. The handwriting looked rushed but unmistakably theirs. I called their cell phone twice straight to voicemail both times. Their social media went dark. It made sense, in the way sudden departures sometimes do when someone's been planning an escape for weeks. Yet my skin prickles when I remember that morning. The note's paper felt too smooth, too fresh, as if it had been written with a hand that trembled slightly. The basement door stood slightly open when I passed it, though I was certain I'd heard it close the night before. A sweet, metallic smell drifted up from below like copper pennies mixed with something organic, something that reminded me of the garden after heavy rain. I descended those stairs with my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement looked exactly as it always had, Concrete walls, storage shelves lined with preserves and old books, the workbench where my housemate tinkered with electronics, nothing out of place, nothing dragged or moved. The floor showed no scuff marks, no signs of disturbance, just dust motes dancing in my phone's pale beam. But the smell lingered, sweet and thick, clinging to the back of my throat like a warning I couldn't quite decipher. I searched every corner, moved boxes, checked behind the water heater. Nothing. The logical part of my mind dismissed it as old plumbing, maybe a small leak somewhere in the walls. Houses develop odors, basements especially. Still, I found myself returning to those stairs throughout the following days, drawn by an inexplicable need to confirm what I'd already confirmed. The basement remained unchanged, empty, normal. My housemate's absence stretched from days into weeks, their silence becoming a presence of its own. The first crack in my certainty came when I was sorting through mail. A credit card bill addressed to my housemate, postmarked 3 days after their supposed departure. Inside, charges from local businesses, the hardware store downtown, the diner we'd visited together countless times, the gas station 2 blocks away. All dated after they'd supposedly left for their new job. My hands shook as I held the statement. There had to be an explanation. Credit card fraud, maybe, or delayed processing of charges from before they left. I called the credit card company, navigating through automated menus until I reached a human voice who confirmed the charges were legitimate, made with a physical card and matching PIN. That night I dreamed of dragging sounds, but in the dream I wasn't lying in bed listening, I was the one pulling something heavy across cold concrete. My hands gripped rough fabric, and beneath it something yielded with each tug. The weight shifted in ways that made my stomach turn even in sleep. I woke with dirt under my fingernails, though I hadn't been gardening. My pajamas smelled of that same sweet, metallic scent. The basement called to me again. This time I brought a proper flashlight and spent an hour examining every inch. The concrete floor showed tiny stains I hadn't noticed before, dark spots that could have been oil or rust or something else entirely. When I knelt to touch one, it flaked away like dried paint or dried something else. Behind the water heater, in a space I was certain I'd checked before, I found a small pile of fabric scraps. Pieces of a shirt I recognized, torn and stained with something that had turned brown with time. My housemate had been wearing that shirt the day before they disappeared. I was sure of it. But memory is unreliable. I could have been wrong about the shirt. The scraps could have been there for months, remnants of some forgotten project. The stains could be anything: paint, food, rust from old pipes. I bagged the fabric anyway, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. The phone calls started a week later. My number, but not my voice on the other end. Silence that felt occupied, breathing that didn't match my rhythm. When I answered, the line would go dead. When I didn't, no message was left. The calls came at random hours, sometimes multiple times in a day, sometimes not for several days straight. I began to notice other things. Lights left on in rooms I was certain I'd darkened. Food missing from the refrigerator, small amounts, easy to dismiss as forgetfulness. The basement door, which I'd started locking, found unlocked on 3 separate occasions. Each time I questioned my own memory. Had I really locked it? Had I really turned off those lights? The second version of events seeps through my consciousness like water through cracks. In this version, I didn't lie passively in bed that night. The footsteps I heard weren't my housemates, they were mine, moving through the house in a state I can barely remember. The dragging sound wasn't something I witnessed from above. It was something I participated in, my muscles straining with effort I've since forgotten. This other version comes in flashes that feel more like sensations than memories. The weight of something in my arms, the scratch of concrete against fabric, the sound of my own breathing, labored and desperate, The metallic taste of fear, or was it something else coating my tongue? In this version, there was no note. I wrote it myself, practicing my housemate's handwriting until it looked convincing enough to fool a casual observer, maybe even to fool myself. The credit card charges weren't evidence of my housemate's continued presence, they were evidence of mine, using cards I'd taken from a wallet that now rests somewhere I refuse to remember. But this version makes no sense. I have no motive, no memory of violence, no recollection of planning or executing anything sinister. It feels like a story someone else is telling about me, using my voice but not my thoughts. When I try to grasp the details, they dissolve like smoke, leaving only the taste of copper and the ache in muscles that shouldn't be sore. The breaking point comes when I find the photos. Hidden in my own closet in a shoebox I don't remember placing there. Pictures of my housemate, but not normal photos, surveillance shots taken from odd angles through windows from across streets. Some are dated weeks before the disappearance. Others show locations I don't recognize, though something about them feels familiar in a way that makes my skin crawl. My fingerprints are on the photos. I can feel the oils from my skin on the glossy paper, but I have no memory of taking them, developing them, hiding them. Looking at them now, I feel like I'm viewing evidence of a crime committed by someone wearing my life like a costume. The basement draws me down again, but this time I see it differently. The workbench isn't just cluttered, it's organized in a way that suggests purpose. Tools arranged not for casual projects, but for something more deliberate. The smell isn't coming from old pipes, it's rising from beneath the concrete itself, from spaces I somehow know exist but can't remember creating. I press my ear to the floor and hear nothing, but my body remembers the vibration of a shovel striking earth, the resistance of clay and roots, the satisfaction of a job completed in darkness. My hands remember the texture of lime, the burn of chemicals meant to accelerate natural processes. Both versions of the truth exist simultaneously now, overlapping and contradicting, until I can no longer distinguish between what I witnessed and what I did. The rational explanation my housemate's sudden departure battles against the physical evidence my body seems to have left for my mind to discover. I find myself checking the basement door compulsively, though I'm no longer sure what I expect to find behind it. Sometimes it's locked, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the smell is stronger, sometimes it's barely detectable. The concrete floor shows different stains depending on the light, the angle, the time of day I choose to look. The phone calls continue. Now I wonder if the breathing on the other end is my own, somehow recorded and played back to me by a mind that's protecting itself from knowledge it can't bear to hold. When I speak into the silence, sometimes I hear an echo that sounds like my voice saying words I don't remember speaking. Sleep brings no relief. Dreams blend with memories until I wake unsure which experiences belong to my unconscious mind and which to my waking hours. I dream of conversations with my housemate that feel more real than the silence that now fills our shared space. In these dreams, they're trying to tell me something important, but their voice is muffled, as if coming from beneath layers of earth and concrete. The investigation I never called for haunts me anyway. I imagine detectives asking questions I can't answer, finding evidence I can't explain, connecting dots that form a picture I refuse to see clearly. But no one comes, no one asks. My housemate's absence creates no ripples in the world beyond our house, as if they were already disappearing long before that final night. I've started leaving the house for hours at a time, walking streets that feel familiar yet strange, as if I'm retracing steps taken in a different state of consciousness. Sometimes I find myself in locations from the photographs, standing in spots where someone was at me. once stood to capture images of a person who no longer exists in any form I can locate. The truth hovers just beyond my grasp, shifting between versions like a mirage that changes depending on the angle of approach. Did I witness something terrible, or did I commit it? Am I protecting myself from trauma or from guilt? The basement keeps its secrets, but my body seems to know them, responding to triggers I can't identify with recognition I can't explain. What disturbs me most isn't the possibility that I've done something unforgivable, it's the growing certainty that I may never know for sure. The mind that could have committed such acts is the same mind trying to solve them, creating a loop of investigation and concealment that may never resolve. Tonight I'll lock the basement door again, though I suspect I'll find it open in the morning. I'll sleep, though I know the dreams will bring more questions than answers. And tomorrow I'll continue living in the space between two truths, neither of which I can fully embrace or completely dismiss. The clock still skips minutes, objects still rest in positions that feel wrong, and the door that should be closed remains ajar, not just the physical door, but the one in my mind that separates what I know from what I fear I might have done. Story 10. Sensor remained dark when I passed. As I moved down the hallway, my footsteps fell silently on the carpet, the usual creak absent. The air seemed heavy, like it was holding its breath, compressing against my skin without a sound. Each door I passed felt as if it had been recently shut, yet none resisted my touch. The floor beneath my feet registered no weight, and the clock on the wall ticked in a rhythmic hesitation. I reached for the handle that should resist, but it felt smooth, untouched, untroubled. In the quiet murmur of the house, something was listening, and it was not me. I suppose it began with the photographs, or perhaps it was the way the coffee cups were arranged on the counter each morning, handles turned at precise angles I never remembered setting. Memory plays tricks, doesn't it? The mind creates patterns where none exist, finds meaning in the mundane arrangement of objects, the subtle displacement of familiar things. The house had always been too quiet, even before the questions started forming in the spaces between thoughts, before I found myself standing in doorways wondering why I'd entered a room. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, pregnant with the weight of unspoken words, unfinished conversations that seemed to hover just beyond hearing. I remember studying the photographs on the mantelpiece, counting them obsessively. 7 frames, always 7, but the faces inside seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly. Not literally, of course. I'm not suggesting anything supernatural. Just the way perspective changes with light, with mood, with a slow accumulation of doubt that settles like dust on everything you thought you knew. The coffee cups bothered me more than they should have. 2 cups, always 2, though I lived alone, had lived alone for months. The second cup would appear clean, unused, but positioned with such deliberate care that it suggested presence. Someone had been there, or was still there, moving through the house with the careful precision of someone who belonged. I began to catalog these small disturbances, the way books appeared on different shelves, not randomly displaced but thoughtfully relocated, as if someone were reorganizing my library according to a system I couldn't decipher. The bathroom mirror, fogged with condensation from showers I hadn't taken. The faint impression of another body in the bed, the sheets wrinkled in patterns that suggested 2 people instead of 1. But memory is unreliable, I know this, I've always known this. The mind fills in gaps, creates narratives to explain the unexplainable. Perhaps I was the one moving the books, arranging the cups, creating the very evidence that disturbed me. Perhaps the photographs had never changed, and I was simply seeing them differently, the way familiar faces can become strange when examined too closely. The hallway sensor had worked perfectly for years. Motion activated, it would flood the corridor with light whenever I passed. but that particular evening it remained dark. I tested it repeatedly, walking back and forth, waving my arms, even jumping slightly to create more obvious movement. Nothing. Yet when I checked the mechanism, everything appeared functional. The bulb wasn't burned out, the wiring intact, the sensor itself clean and unobstructed. I called the landlord about it, though I'm not sure why. The conversation felt strange, stilted, as if we were discussing something entirely different than a broken motion sensor. He assured me someone would look at it, but his voice carried an odd quality, a careful neutrality that suggested he knew something I didn't. Or perhaps I was reading too much into his tone, the way I'd begun reading too much into everything. The repair never happened, or if it did, I wasn't aware of it. The sensor remained dark, and I found myself avoiding the hallway when possible, taking longer routes through the house that felt safer somehow. Safer from what I couldn't say. The darkness itself wasn't threatening. It was the implication that I wasn't there, wasn't real enough to trigger the mechanism that had responded to my presence for so long. I started staying up later, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, watching the photographs on the mantelpiece, waiting for something to change, for some confirmation that I wasn't imagining the subtle shifts in arrangement, the way shadows fell differently across familiar faces. The house settled around me with its usual sounds, the refrigerator humming, pipes creaking, the distant murmur of traffic, but underneath it all was something else. A presence that breathed when I held my breath, that moved when I was perfectly still. The photographs were family pictures mostly, gatherings and celebrations from years past, faces smiling at the camera with the forced cheerfulness of posed moments. But the more I studied them, the more I noticed the spaces between people, the careful distances maintained even in moments of supposed intimacy. Everyone seemed to be looking slightly away from each other, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. There was one photograph in particular that drew my attention, a group shot taken at what appeared to be a holiday dinner. Everyone seated around a long table, hands folded, expressions pleasant but somehow hollow. I counted the people obsessively, 8 faces, all familiar, all family. But when I looked more carefully, I noticed something odd about the seating arrangement. There was a gap, a space where someone should have been sitting, a place setting with no corresponding person. I examined the photograph with a magnifying glass, searching for evidence of tampering, of digital manipulation that might explain the missing figure. But the image appeared authentic, unaltered. The gap was simply there, as if someone had been carefully erased not just from the photograph, but from memory itself. I found myself staring at that empty space for hours, trying to remember who should have been sitting there, what face belonged in that carefully maintained absence. The coffee cups multiplied, not literally, but in my awareness of them. I began finding them in rooms I rarely entered, placed on surfaces where I never drank coffee. Always clean, always positioned with that same deliberate precision that suggested intention rather than carelessness. I started washing them immediately when I found them, but they would reappear within hours, as if the act of removing them only confirmed their necessity. Sleep became difficult, not because of noise or discomfort, but because of the opposite. The house was too quiet, too still. I found myself lying awake, listening for sounds that never came, waiting for footsteps that remained unheard. The silence was so complete it felt artificial, manufactured, as if someone were actively suppressing the normal sounds of habitation. I began to question my own memory, my own perceptions. Had the sensor ever worked properly? Had there always been 2 coffee cups? Were the photographs arranged differently, or had I simply never noticed their configuration before? The uncertainty was more disturbing than any definitive answer would have been. At least certainty provides something to react against, something concrete to fear or dismiss. The house itself seemed to be changing, though I couldn't identify specific alterations. Rooms felt smaller or larger than they should have been. Hallways stretched longer than I remembered or contracted into spaces that seemed impossibly narrow. The familiar geography of my own home became foreign, requiring conscious navigation through areas I should have been able to traverse blindfolded. I started leaving notes for myself, small reminders placed strategically around the house. Sensor broken taped to the hallway wall. 2 cups Y written on a sticky note attached to the coffee maker. Count photos scrawled on my hand in blue ink, but the notes would disappear or relocate, appearing in different rooms with additional comments written in handwriting I didn't recognize, but that looked disturbingly similar to my own. The mirror in the bathroom began reflecting things that weren't there. Not dramatically, not obviously. Just small discrepancies that became apparent only when I looked carefully. An extra towel hanging on a hook where I kept only one. A second toothbrush in the holder beside mine. Shadows that suggested another person standing just outside the frame of reflection, present but invisible. I covered the mirror with a towel, but that created its own problems. The covered surface became a focal point for my anxiety, a hidden space where anything might be happening. I found myself lifting the corner of the towel to peek underneath, checking to make sure the reflection showed only what should be there. But each glimpse revealed new inconsistencies, small changes that accumulated into a comprehensive sense of displacement. The photographs began to seem less like memories and more like evidence. Evidence of what I couldn't determine, but their arrangement on the mantelpiece took on the quality of a deliberate message. 7 frames, but 8 people in the group shot, with one person missing from both the image and my recollection. The mathematics didn't work, but the emotional logic was undeniable. Someone had been there and was now gone, not just absent, but actively erased. I called family members, casual conversations designed to elicit information about the missing person in the photograph. But every conversation felt scripted, as if everyone was carefully avoiding certain topics, certain names. When I mentioned the holiday dinner directly, voices would become guarded, responses evasive. "I don't remember that particular gathering," they would say, or "Are you sure you have the right occasion?" The collective amnesia felt coordinated, deliberate. The house began to feel like a stage set, perfectly arranged but somehow hollow. Every object was in its proper place, every surface clean and organized, but the overall effect was theatrical rather than lived in. I started moving things deliberately, creating small messes and disorganizations to make the space feel more authentic. But by morning, everything would be restored to its previous state, as if invisible hands worked through the night to maintain the illusion of perfection. I installed a camera in the living room, a small device pointed at the mantelpiece to record any changes in the photograph arrangement. But when I reviewed the footage, I found hours of static, empty frames where the recording should have been. The camera functioned perfectly when I tested it during the day, but the overnight recordings were consistently corrupted, useless. The coffee cups became an obsession. I counted them compulsively, checking cabinets and drawers to ensure I knew the exact number in the house. 12 cups total, but somehow there were always 2 on the counter, positioned as if for a conversation that had just ended or was about to begin. I started hiding cups, locking them in closets, even taking some to work with me. But the 2 on the counter remained constant, unchanging, as if the house itself was generating them from some inexhaustible supply. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of conversations I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Voices in the kitchen, laughter in the living room, the sound of footsteps on stairs that led nowhere. I would wake with the certainty that someone had been in the house, that I had been talking with them just moments before, but the details would evaporate as soon as I tried to focus on them. The sensor remained dark, I stopped trying to fix it, stopped calling the landlord, stopped waving my arms in futile attempts to trigger the mechanism. Instead, I began to wonder if the darkness was intentional, if I was meant to pass through that hallway undetected, unacknowledged. Perhaps visibility was the problem, not invisibility. Perhaps being seen was what I should fear. The photographs were watching me, not literally, but with the persistent attention of unresolved questions. The missing person in the group shot became more present in their absence than the visible faces were in their clarity. I found myself talking to that empty space, asking questions that received no answers, making apologies for transgressions I couldn't remember committing. I began to understand that the house wasn't haunted in any traditional sense. It was simply incomplete, missing essential elements that had been carefully removed or systematically forgotten. The coffee cups, the photographs, the broken sensor, all evidence of a presence that had been methodically erased but couldn't be entirely eliminated. Traces remained, like the impression of text on a page after the original words have been deleted. The mirror in the bathroom, when I finally uncovered it permanently, showed only what should be there. But the relief was temporary, replaced by a new anxiety about what wasn't being reflected, what might be standing behind me in spaces the mirror couldn't reveal. I started turning around suddenly, checking corners, examining shadows for evidence of movement that shouldn't exist. Memory became unreliable in new ways. I would remember conversations clearly, but couldn't recall who I'd been talking with. I would have vivid recollections of shared meals, but the second place setting would be empty, the food untouched. The past was full of gaps shaped like a person I couldn't quite remember, someone who had been systematically edited out of my history, but whose absence created its own form of presence. The house settled into its strange new rhythms. 2 coffee cups appeared each morning. The photographs maintained their careful arrangement. The sensor remained dark when I passed, as if I were moving through a space that didn't quite acknowledge my existence. But gradually these anomalies began to feel normal, expected. The strange became familiar, and familiarity bred a kind of acceptance. I stopped questioning the coffee cups, stopped counting the photographs, stopped trying to remember who was missing from the group shot. Instead, I began to appreciate the mystery, the way uncertainty created its own form of companionship. The house was full of questions that didn't require answers, puzzles that were more interesting unsolved. The darkness in the hallway became comforting rather than disturbing. Moving through undetected space felt like a form of freedom, a way of existing without the burden of constant visibility. I began to understand that some presences are more powerful when they remain unacknowledged, that absence can be more meaningful than presence. But understanding didn't eliminate the questions. If anything, acceptance made the mystery deeper, more complex. The house continued its quiet performance, maintaining the illusion of normalcy while acknowledging the gaps where normalcy failed. The coffee cups, the photographs, the broken sensor, all part of a larger pattern that remained just beyond comprehension. I passed through the hallway now without expecting the sensor to respond. The darkness has become natural, appropriate. My footsteps fall silently on the carpet, the usual creak absent, and I no longer wonder why. The air seems heavy, like it's holding its breath, and I hold mine in response, participating in the house's quiet conspiracy of unacknowledged presence. The sensor remains dark when I pass, just as it should.